Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me today. It is our weekend edition. We'll have a lot to cover in the next couple of hours. Of course, North Korea, South Korea, that's kind of an interesting issue, how that's played out and what will happen in the summit. One of the articles we've posted here is by one of our participants around the round table, I should say Jeremy Dice. I'm so used to saying doctor, but of course a lawyer. Jeremy Dice with us. Again, this is very good. Senators are failing the religious test for office. Another article we're going to post shortly by one of the other individuals around the round table, Lathan Watts, why the left is wrong about Jefferson's wall of separation between church and state. And then, of course, we talked a little bit about Alfie Evans yesterday and what that might mean in terms of health care. We'll certainly want to say some things about the verdict that came down yesterday. We talked about Bill Cosby and the DACA decision and much, much more. So lots to cover. And Jeremy, always great to have you in studio.
Well, thanks for having me, Kerby. Good to be back here.
And again, let me introduce, I think for the first time, Lathan Watts, who is the author of one of the articles we're posting here, and also an individual that works at First Liberty, Director of Community Relations. Just great to have you with us as well.
Thank you for having me.
And a graduate of Mississippi Law School. I just mentioned,
Correct.
I always like to mention the law degrees from you guys, but everybody's hearing Jeremy every day. We feel like we know you because you're here almost you're here even when I'm not here because we hear your commentaries.
Well, it's good to have it on here. I'm glad that you're able to play it.
Yeah, the First Liberty briefing, so well done. I've learned so many things about that. And since we're talking about religious liberty, let's do so. I was in a meeting the other day where somebody was saying, I've heard that First Liberty has a half a dozen cases that might end up in the Supreme Court. Where do we stand on those?
Yeah, we do, as a matter of fact. And it could be right now that the Supreme Court is sitting there conferencing on one or more of our cases at this very moment. And as a matter of fact, we'll find out Monday whether or not they did. We've had, I think, 3 of our cases relisted now 8 or 9 times, which is somewhat interesting, and we're trying to figure out exactly what that means. But it must mean, at the very least, that they're taking a good, hard look at these cases and whether or not they want to review them or if they want to say something about them, even if they decide not to hear the ultimate case. But, yeah, we've got the 2 cases that are involving legislative prayer, Rowan County, North Carolina, Jackson County, Michigan, where they've had people come to say, look, we understand that they could have a volunteer come in and pray. They from the church across the street. They could have a paid chaplain come in and pray. The Supreme Court's already held those 2 things are perfectly constitutional. Now the debate is whether or not these lawmakers, by the nature of them being lawmakers, are forbidden from being able to pray or not. You can have the volunteer, you can have the paid chaplain. Why can't you have those that are elected officials themselves leading these prayers? That's what we're hoping the Supreme Court will provide clarity on. We hope in our cases here before long. We got Marianne Sauce, who's told she's not allowed to pray in her own home during a criminal investigation. There's some very interesting little dynamics going on there and questions implicating procedure and civil law or criminal law and that sort of thing. Very, very interesting little case that we're waiting to find out more about. We've got Livingston Christian School, who was zoned out of their town, and that one is just shocking to me because if a little town like Genoa Township, Michigan, outside of Detroit can say that this little school can't occupy a church building and build its own religious school there, then we've got no hopes for synagogues, for mosques, for churches and cathedrals and that sort of thing being able to hold sway there as well. We've got Joe Kennedy is coming up here pretty soon. That's been done at the Ninth Circuit for a while. That'll be appealed to the Supreme Court of the United States. That's the coach that took a knee for 15 or 30 seconds after the game and was fired for doing so. A silent prayer for 15 to 30 seconds, and he was fired for that. Ninth Circuit said, no problem with that. We want the Supreme Court to say no, that there's a big problem there. And then, of course, we've got our final case with the Bladensburg Veterans Memorial outside of Washington, D.C., This gravestone to 49 men outside of Washington, D.C., the 49 men of Prince George's County who died defending our freedom in World War I. Judges have even said that maybe the solution here is to chop the cross-shaped arms off of this memorial to solve the issue. Look, as we've said many times before, if that monument is ultimately torn down because of this legal decision, then standing at jeopardy are the memorials in Arlington National Cemetery, perhaps even the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier itself, and literally hundreds, if not thousands, of monuments across this country that have religious imagery on it, meant to remember the sacrifice, the ultimate sacrifice our men and women have made in the armed forces. We can't allow that to happen.
Yeah, right there in the Fourth Circuit, which is getting almost as crazy as the Ninth Circuit, but we'll leave that for another conversation. 2 weeks ago was the anniversary of Thomas Jefferson's birthday. And Lathan, you wrote a piece called Why the Left is Wrong About Jefferson's Wall of Separation Between Church and State. And every one of these comes back to this idea that, well, we can't allow an individual to pray in their homes. We can't have a cross in a public arena. We can't have two Christian schools actually have a prayer over the public address system. And, of course, we'll get into a little bit later whether or not you can force Christians to actually bake a cake for a lesbian ceremony. But it all comes back to this letter that Thomas Jefferson wrote to the Danbury Baptist Association. But explain to us for just a few minutes why the left is so wrong about this idea of the wall of separation.
Thank you, and thank you for having me. To start with, you have to take Jefferson. What they have done is taken this one line from one letter of Thomas Jefferson to a group of people who were concerned about weak religious liberty protections at the state level. They've taken that one sentence from one letter and made that out to be the entirety of what Jefferson thought of the concept of separation of church and state, as found in that letter. To do what they have done, you have to willfully ignore volumes of other things that Jefferson wrote, and you also have to turn a blind eye to things that he actually did as president.
Yes.
So it's a tactic that people use a lot. Take one thing and expand it into many other things. But even the cases that Jeremy mentioned that are currently hopefully going to be corrected by the Supreme Court. Can a legislator, a county commissioner, open the county commissioner's court with prayer? The founding fathers opened their sessions with prayer before there was a First Amendment.
Right.
I mean, these men did it themselves, so it's hard for me to believe that when Jefferson wrote this letter, to the Danbury Baptist, that he was thinking.
Yeah, he used to go to religious services and support religious services.
Yeah, and oddly enough, if people are careful listeners of the First Liberty Briefing, they've heard the story about Jefferson the day he wrote this letter, welcoming a giant wheel of cheese to the White House, brought there from a congregation up in that way by a pastor himself, welcomed it there, and then he left to go to services at the United States Capitol building.
Which was the largest church in the Capitol.
Church in Washington, D.C. at the time. Yeah. So it doesn't sound like this is exactly the way that people ought to be interpreting that phrase.
Well, and again, some of this was plucked out of obscurity in 1947 when Justice Hugo Black took it and used it in a way that was almost inappropriate. Isn't that something part of your article as well, isn't it?
Well, yes. I mean, it has been sort of read into Supreme Court decisions, and to the point where I think most people, if they're not, you don't have to be a constitutional scholar to understand this, but a lot of people, if you did some man on the street interviews, would probably expect that language is in the Constitution.
Oh yes.
It's been read into opinions many times, and that's I think that's telling that folks that want to see the Constitution interpreted a certain way will rely on things like a phrase from a letter from Jefferson versus what the text of the Constitution actually says.
As Jeremy knows, I used to speak a lot more on college campuses, and sometimes in a government class, kids would say, "What about separation of church and state?" And I'd hold up my Constitution, say, "Can you show me where that is?" And after a few minutes, I say, "Let me help you out. The words church, state, separation aren't even in the Constitution." They go, "Really?" We'll talk more about that right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
A number of months ago, the American Journal of Political Science issued a correction to a previous study. What was their error? The journal reversed its conclusion that conservative individuals exhibited traits associated with psychotism. They admitted that the interpretation of the coding was exactly reversed. In other words, it was liberal individuals, not conservative individuals, that exhibited these traits. As one commentator put it, that's one heck of an oops. This finding made quite a splash in technical journals. For example, the publication Retraction Watch had the headline, "Conservative Political Beliefs Not Linked to Psychotic Traits as Study Claimed." It reported that researchers have fixed a number of papers that mistakenly reported that people with conservative beliefs exhibit traits associated with psychotism, such as authoritarianism and tough-mindedness. One article that appeared in The Cut tries to answer a very important question: why it took social science years to correct a simple error about psychotism. A PhD student in psychology at the University of Minnesota concluded that the authors had simply inverted the items in the survey. Although the article helps to explain how the error began, it doesn't really spend much time talking about why it took so long to discover the error. Is it possible that the erroneous findings that conservatives exhibit these traits was not discovered because it reinforced the bias most liberal researchers in psychology already have? On most college campuses, there is a prevailing view that conservatives are rigid, intolerant, and closed-minded. And there is also the view that liberals and progressives are flexible, tolerant, and open to new ideas. But if you spend any time at the major universities, you will often see just the opposite. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For more information about issues covered on Viewpoints, visit pointofview.net. Pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, it is our weekend edition. If you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. Posted a number of articles that we're going to be talking about today. Jeremy Dice with us, Lathan Watts. And Lathan, let me come to you for just another minute. Why the left is wrong about Jefferson's wall of separation between church and state. You give us some great illustrations. One we mentioned a minute ago with these county commissioners saying you can't open the commission in prayer, which is amazing because, okay, even think about James Madison. Right after he pushed through what eventually became the First Amendment, he actually established chaplains. So that's as hard. But what about some of these others? You've got some articles here about prayer and your job, even the idea of saying God at a military retirement ceremony. Gosh, we got to get Michael in here today to talk about that one. What about some of these cases?
Sure. So I referenced our client, Tony Richardson, who's an educational technician in a public high school in Augusta, Maine, who told a coworker, and the person was also a fellow church member of hers, in a conversation, I will pray for you. And she was later reprimanded by the administration there and threatened with discipline up to termination if she continued to use such unprofessional language. And so use that illustration and then say, you know, what would Jefferson think of this? And not just what has Jefferson written, but what did he do?
Yes.
You know, as president, he was also the first head of the D.C. Public School Board.
Yes.
Wrote the first plan of education for schools in Washington, D.C. His plan used two books to teach reading, the Bible and Isaac Watts' hymnal. So something tells me he would not have had a problem with a public school teacher telling another public school teacher
I don't think
I'll pray
so.
for you.
Yeah, you see Isaac Watts, of course, and some of the other things, the New England Primer and all sorts of stuff. I mean, that was just kind of routine. One that we have talked about, but it's been a while, is and maybe both of you can give us an update on that. We talked about this man by the name of Oscar Rodriguez and wanting to give this flag-folding speech. And everything is good until he mentions the word God, and then you see people literally grabbing him and pulling him out. And I encourage people to go to First Liberty, because when you hear these stories, you think, you're making it up. No,
Right.
you got this on video, don't you?
Exactly. You can go to firstliberty.org, look up Oscar Rodriguez. You can see the video of the incident itself. But this was a retirement ceremony for a fellow airman, Chuck Roberson, who requested Oscar to give this speech. He'd seen it before, and Oscar complied. He was going to give the flag-folding speech, and is approached by uniformed airmen and literally drug out of the room.
Yeah, I mean, you got to get this image in your brain. This is radio, so let's paint the picture for you here. And you can go to firstliberty.org right now to watch it, too. But so you've seen this flag-folding ceremony before, whether you know it or not. It's when two soldiers, or airmen in this case, get up there, take the flag, and fold it. And for every crease that they make, there's a certain kind of history that goes with that and tradition. And there's the speech that Oscar gives is very moving, very stirring, and he gives it in a very forceful and uplifting kind of a way. That's why his colleague, his airman, wanted him, Chuck Roberson, wanted him to provide this at his only retirement ceremony he'll ever have. Yeah. And so Oscar gets up there to give this speech, and as he does so, 3 or 4 of these guys dressed in their ABUs, their camouflage digicamo uniforms on there, they stand up and they literally grab Oscar by the shoulders, by the scruff of his jacket, and pick him up and carry him out while Oscar continues to try to provide this script. They throw him right out of the room. Look, if you're wondering what's the law on this, it's very clear. No American citizen should be denied the right to say the word God on an Air Force base. Oscar is a veteran, so he's got some access to the bases perhaps that you and I don't, but he's a private citizen. Imagine if you walked on the base and tried to say God bless you in this type of a ceremony, and you were picked up by some members of the military and carried out. That is entirely unacceptable. Certainly the men and women of our armed forces that we ask to go fight our nation's battles, that literally throw bombs off of planes and shoot guns and all that sort of thing against hardened enemies intent on killing us, certainly they're tough enough to be able to hear the word God in a retirement ceremony.
Yes, well, and again, one of the things that we've talked about with Michael Berry when he's been on here is just the incredible need. You have a whole division now just for the military issues. And of course, we've talked about Colonel Leland Bohannon actually having his record returned back to what it should have been. And we've had so many other cases that you wouldn't have expected that this kind of religious bigotry or this hostility to Christianity would show up in the military, would you?
Well, yes and no, right? It should not be the case. But the reality is that the military is a microcosm of the entire country. And it's just really a kind of a compressed environment. There's a lot of emotions running because it's a tough environment as well. And, the military has some necessary restraints that they need to put on their service members because of order and discipline and all that. But one thing that our men and women of our armed forces don't give up, they give up a lot of rights when they go into the military. They have to. But one thing they never give up is the right to religious liberty, nor should we ever expect them to do that. They retain their religious liberty even when they go through boot camp. And so if you're listening on a forward operating base somewhere, or if you're at an Air Force base or Army base or a post somewhere out here in the country, and you don't know what your religious liberty rights are when it comes to your service, please go to firstliberty.org. We've got a toolkit for you to review so that you know what they are. And that, my brother-in-law is in the Air Force as an example, and I know his commitment to his faith, and I know what that means to him, both at home for his sons, his wife, but also when he carries himself into work, just like everybody else does when they go into work. I want him to know what his religious liberty rights are every bit as much as the lowly sergeant or the lowly private that just came through boot camp today. Go know what your rights are. If you got a question, don't try to risk it. Give us a call. Your calls are confidential to us anyway. It's something called attorney-client privilege. We can't go blabbing about it unless you tell us to. And the good news about it is if we can help you with your case, if we're able to work with you on this, you're not going to get a bill from us. We do our work pro bono. That's a big fancy Latin word meaning free. And so we'd be glad to review that with you. So go to firstliberty.org, find out more about it, and then click on that Get Legal Help Now button at the top if you need some help from us.
Again, if you go to our website, pointofview.net, you'll find the piece here by Lathan, and then also a piece that we're going to be talking about with Jeremy, but it also has a link to First Liberty. And as you go there, you can go to their resource section, and they have packets of materials. So if you're worried about the schools, and we're coming to graduation, so here we go again, baccalaureates, graduations, we're going to be hearing about that. If you're wondering about your rights in the job, they have those. If you're wondering about your rights in the church, they have those. And for our military, we have one for military as well. And it's amazing. When you first brought Michael Berry on, I said, I wonder if he's going to be twiddling his thumbs over here just occasionally taking a case. And he's just been as busy as any one of you guys there, hasn't he?
He absolutely has, yeah. And he's thankfully on some R&R right now, recouping for the battle ahead. So that's good. Hey, if I can come back to this Daily Signal article that Lathan wrote, we can't pass over that with sharing a little bit of homespun wisdom that Lathan laces inside of this editorial. I love it when he's talking about these perpetually offended groups that I call them the angry acronyms of the week, usually, ACLU, FFRF, AHA, those kinds of things. They always use this phrase in a never-ending litigious stream, as he says, a litigious assault. But this is the best line. Hell-bent on exorcising religion from American life, they have no shortage of plaintiffs from sea to shining sea, all faithful congregants at Our Blessed Mother of the Perpetually Offended. Maybe, Lathan, you can tell us what you're thinking with that line, man.
Just trying to infuse a little bit of personality into a column, but it is, I think, obvious to a lot of people. There is a professional plaintiffs class in America. You can go back to
and they're the Freedom from Religion Foundation and the ACLU and the Americans United for Separation of Church and State, and all my buddies, all the ones I've debated over the years or run into or had letters from. Yes,
yeah, exactly. I mean, you could go back to previous cases. First Liberty has litigated other World War I memorials, the Mojave Desert Cross. How far out of your way do you have to drive to get offended by that?
That's the best of the examples. I mean, even Bladensburg, you got a video up there right now. I'd never really seen the cross with the traffic. I'm going, how in the world could you even notice that unless you're offended? But the one in the Mojave Desert, you have got to be out there in the desert.
You are on a mission to get offended.
And drive.
Well, in Bladensburg, you feel like you're a little bit on the National Lampoon's Vacation, looking at Big Ben and Parliament, going around kind of. You have to go kind of on this merry-go-round as you go around it all. So I don't even know how you have time to stop and look at it, frankly. But there you are.
But I love your example, because that one always caught me off guard. The Mojave Desert. I mean, having grown up in California and knowing where that is and knowing how far you'd have to drive and make sure you bring some water in case your car breaks down, and then eventually seeing the cross in the distance and saying, I'm going to take this to court. And then, of course, that goes all the way to the Supreme Court, which brings me back to something maybe we can talk about after the break. After the Supreme Court rules that a cross is okay, you would think the Mojave Desert case would solve the one in San Diego and in Maryland, but no, you'd be wrong on that one, wouldn't you? So we're going to come back and talk about that. And I do want to get into this very excellent piece, because not only is this Daily Signal piece written by Lathan Watts, which I think you would want to read, but also if you want to go to The Hill, which is kind of the journal of record for Capitol Hill, we have the piece by Jeremy on Senators Are Failing the Religious Test for Office. Senator Cory Booker, probably the most offended these days, but Dianne Feinstein, Dick Durbin, and Bernie Sanders also in that class of, what did we refer to those? Again, just a great little line there. Those who are part of the congregants of Our Blessed Mother are perpetually offended. We'll be right back.
Is religious freedom still a cornerstone of the Republic, or has it effectively been crushed by the forces of tolerance? America needs Christians to be informed and as unified as possible, applying God's wisdom to civic life. Point of View can be a key part of a successful mission. I believe in America. I believe God wants His best for us. We can face whatever the world throws at us as long as we stand together. If you have not signed on, please do it now. Support Point of View Radio today at pointofview.net. Set up your monthly gift by clicking the Truth Team 360 picture and then carefully follow the directions. Pointofview.net. By phone, you can give at 1-800-347-5151. 800-347-5151. Or mail that first donation to Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221. Box 30, Dallas 75221. Or call us 800-347-5151. The Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, is Kerby Anderson.
Weekend edition, if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Might also mention, in addition to sending out the broadcast and hearing it on radio, and you can go to pointofview.net and listen to it or watch it, we also are broadcasting live on Facebook Live, and I'll go back to it in just a minute because I noticed there were some comments, so I'll certainly take some there if you'd like to ask a question or make a comment about some of those issues. But one of the things we always make available to everybody is a copy of the Constitution. And I thought I might come to you, Jeremy, for just a minute, because as I look at Article 6 in the Constitution, there's just a phrase that's thrown in there that there should be no religious test. And that brings us to an article that we've posted here. Senators are failing the religious test for office. Can you give us some history about the religious test? Why is it in there in the first place?
Well, it's a kind of an obscure clause within the Constitution towards the very end of the document itself, but history will tell us very quickly that there have been tests that have been asserted for one's religiosity or not, and it has been used both to say that you're too religious to be able to meet this office, or more commonly, you're not religious enough to be able to meet this office, and both of those are wrong. And so our founding fathers put in place there this idea that in our country, with our commitment to this welcoming of everyone in the public square, having the freedom to exercise your religion, just a few sentences later, which in what would become the First Amendment, we're going to say Congress will make no law regarding the free exercise of your religious beliefs or your religion. So the founding fathers were intent on making sure that everybody were able to come together, that everybody was baseline qualified to serve in public office and to run this great experiment in democracy. And so as we, the people, formed that more perfect union, we wanted to make sure that all the people were qualified to be able to serve in that office. And so in Article 6, towards the end, it says, the final clause says, no religious test shall ever be required as a qualification to any office or public trust under the United States. And that has largely fallen away from any interest. I bet you didn't learn about it in a civics class.
Probably not.
But it's still there. Mm-hmm. And it's still important because while we may not have a formalized sit down and fill out the bubble sheet to answer the religious test for office anymore, or ever have had it to begin with, we have this creeping implicit religious test for office that we've seen even this week.
Well, we certainly have, and one of those has to do with Mike Pompeo. Now, you talk about one of the most qualified individuals for the Secretary of State, replacing one of the least qualified. Now, nothing against Rex Tillerson. As a matter of fact, he was an outstanding CEO for Exxon, and I remember going to meetings with shareholders and being very impressed with him. But let's face it, he had not had much foreign policy experience, and yet he was actually confirmed as Secretary of the State. Of course, now you have Mike Pompeo just barely actually confirmed as Secretary of the State. But here's a man who was first in his class at West Point, first in his class, as I understand, at Harvard Law School, Harvard Law Review, entrepreneur, member of Congress, confirmed to being the CIA director, and now all of a sudden there's a big controversy. Now, again, the controversy comes from some who I think are going to be running for the presidency, but the question had to do with whether or not Mike Pompeo, a Christian, there already you got two strikes against you, actually holds to orthodox beliefs of Christianity. Fill us out.
Yeah, and think about the situation here for 1 minute. You've got just a limited amount of time that senators are given to inquire as to the qualifications as they provide the constitutional required advice and consent. Now, that has changed from advice and consent to some form of bullying and grandstanding all the time now, it seems like anyway. But this is the time that Cory Booker is supposed to dedicate to using, hey, what's your foreign policy stand on X? How are you going to run the office on Y? What are your educational credentials on this topic and on that topic? No, that's not what he spends his time going into. Instead, he is lobbying angry question after angry question to Mike Pompeo for daring to have a rather orthodox view of human sexuality based upon his religious beliefs. Now, Booker will go on to Facebook later on to say that he has a very similar religious conviction, or at least he comes from the same religious tradition, supposedly, but he believes that his religious tradition teaches something differently. Okay, fine, that's great, Senator Booker. Have that position. We're all supposed to be free to be able to have that position. What you're not free to do is to impose that as a reason for you to opt out. And here's the funny thing about that. Senators can vote for or against a nominee for any reason, literally any reason you want to have out there. I don't like how big your nose is. We're going to vote for you. But it's one thing to be opposed to someone because they're unprofessional, they're not qualified for office, they've got a big nose or no hair. It's something else entirely to be opposed to someone, then announce that opposition because of their religious belief. That is a religious test for office. And so the point of the piece that I have here is to tell future nominees, because we've seen this multiple times already, haven't we? We've seen this with Senator Sanders. We've seen it with Senator Feinstein. You remember her talking about Amy Coney Barrett and how the dogma lives loudly within her?
Mm-hmm.
So we've seen this time and time again. My advice to future nominees that run into this issue is to, like we've done with the Fifth Amendment, where you're not allowed to incriminate yourself, say, I plead the Sixth. I plead the Article 6 of the Constitution. Senator, that is a religious test for office, and on the basis of that and my right as an American not to have a religious test of office lobbed against me, I refuse to answer your question.
Yes, well, and I'm waiting for that to show up, and maybe your piece will encourage somebody to do so. Let's remind some of our listeners, when Bernie Sanders was attacking, again, Russell Vogt, and again, that was for Office of Management and Budget, you would think those questions would have something to do with your fiscal policy, maybe the issues of taxation. But instead, he goes back to a kind of a letter to the editor response to something that happened at Wheaton College. And so, again, you have people reaching deep into sometimes even obscure statement somebody's made and make that a justification for why they feel that these people aren't just not going to get their vote, but those people by that definition are unqualified to even serve in office.
Yeah, and it's further evidence of how absolutely the public flogging that takes place for any of these nominees that go out there. You should have them in your prayers every day, because they've got to go through so much scrutiny on things. You know, tell me about your tax records going back to when you were in the womb. I mean, it's basically that detailed. And then they're bringing out every little, every note you wrote to an elementary school sweetheart in class, and examining that to determine whether or not you're, some kind of weirdo to come out on these things. No, that's not what this advice and consent was put out there to be. It was to say, okay, that the executive has the prerogative to nominate people for his positions in his cabinet, in this case, or for nominations for judges and et cetera. We want to make sure that, we provide some consent to this. Okay, good nominee. Go ahead with this. Or if that's someone you don't agree with, fine, that's perfectly fine. Now state your disagreement or state your agreement on the matter to the president and remind him how to handle it. That's called advice. Hey, yeah. My advice to you is to not bring these kinds of people into the future. But ultimately, it isn't to say this guy is wrong and horrible because of his religious beliefs. That violates the Constitution, and we should not be. All of us as Americans should not stand for this. And I hope you as listeners are getting as angry as I am when I wrote this piece, when I hear yet another senator saying, hey, you're basically not qualified because of the same religious beliefs that you and I hold. And millions of Americans hold these religious beliefs. Therefore, we're not qualified to be able to serve in any form of government. That's wrong, and the Constitution says so.
And again, I would make the case that the previous Secretary of State did well, but he wasn't as qualified as this one. I mean, there probably has never been an individual more qualified to be Secretary of State in recent history here than an individual that's been a CIA director and has actually been looking at all of these intelligence briefings. But two other individuals in the past would be John Kerry and Hillary Clinton, who everybody said were qualified and received 95 votes each for them. And so, Lathan, if nothing else, it just illustrates again, it's not just I'm going to vote against you because you don't have hair, you have a big nose or whatever, or don't like the way you wear your suit or something. It's saying you don't even have a right to serve in office. This is pretty amazing.
Correct. And every one of these senators that are posing these unconstitutional questions, they took an oath when they were sworn in as senators to protect and defend the Constitution. And I would suggest to them a good first step would be to read it.
And the other part of that is that, again, back to the idea of advice and consent, I might recommend not only reading the Constitution, but, maybe read the Federalist Papers, which I had to do when I was at Georgetown University. I mean, I had to read those as carefully as I was asked to read the Bible in seminary, or read the notes to the Constitutional Convention. I think what you would find there is advice and consent was really just to prevent nepotism, unqualified individuals back then from being put into the post office when they didn't have a clue as to what they were doing, but they were just it was a patronage place. But that's all it was supposed to be. It wasn't a place for grandstanding, was it?
Well, certainly not to the degree that it is today. Now, politics kind of breeds that in every context and every culture we find ourselves with here. But I want Senator Booker to realize what he's saying to the rest of the nation. You've got millions of Americans, not just in the Christian faith, that hold to the same position as Mike Pompeo may hold, but all the other Abrahamic traditions as well. You've got millions more in the Jewish circles, in Muslim circles, and he's effectively telegraphing to them, along with his colleagues, Senator Dick Durbin, Senator Feinstein from California, Senator Sanders from Vermont, they've all attacked a religious belief of largely Catholic or Christian individuals that are up for office. They are now they're now telegraphing to the rest of the country, whether you're Christian, Catholic, Protestant, or Jewish or Muslim, they're basically saying you're not welcome. And by the way, if you come up here as a nominee, we are going to make fun of you, we're going to mock you, and we're going to hold you in absolute disregard and eventually not vote on you because of your religious beliefs. That's wrong.
Yeah. When you have somebody as qualified as Mike Pompeo, and he's willing to put himself through that, how many others are we missing because they say no mas? We'll be right back.
Many tributes to former First Lady and First Mom Barbara Bush describe her 1990 Wellesley graduation speech, which placed her, at least according to the Washington Post, at the center of a national debate about the nature of feminism that would continue for decades. Feminists claim their movement is about making choices, but 150 Wellesley students protested that Mrs. Bush had, quote, gained recognition through the achievements of her husband. Not quite the Wellesley way. In the end, she wowed the crowd, telling them that, quote, you are a human being first, and those human connections with spouses, with children, with friends, are the most important investments you will ever make. In a recent National Review article, Heather Wilhelm contrasts what she calls today's sad feminism with the values exhibited in Barbara Bush's life. She writes that as Mrs. Bush rose above society's dream, so did Tammy Jo Schultz, the Southwest airline pilot who just last week guided a crippled plane to a safe landing after the mid-air explosion of one of its engines. Heather Wilhelm points out that Captain Schultz, age 56, learned to fly in the Navy at a time when the idea of women flying fighter jets often earned dismissive scoffs. Growing up near an Air Force base, she watched jets in action and fell in love. Ms. Wilhelm says modern feminism tells women there is one way to think, to the left, and the Barbara Bush-like dream of being a full-time mother and devoting time to family is often brushed aside as less worthy than the aspiration to be a scientist or an engineer or a CEO. A better feminism would applaud women who find ways to make life better for those whom God places in their orbit. This feminism would empower a woman, perhaps a pilot, perhaps a first lady, who carries out with calm and grace, and often with nerves of steel, the roles life tosses her way. For Point of View, I'm Penna Dexter.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes before the top of the hour, and again, we have in studio with us Lathan Watts and Jeremy Dice. And one of the other points that I thought I might bring up has to do with the fact that Cory Booker was upset with Mike Pompeo because he doesn't kind of toe the line on LGBT. And that kind of brings me back, Lathan, to one of the things you mentioned. There is an index that you produce every year called Undeniable. And it does seem to me that more and more of these religious liberty issues all go back to LGBT. In other words, there seems to be an assumption, as one person put it, that if there's a debate between LGBT issues and religious liberty loses. And so in some respects, Cory Booker was just following the philosophy I'm starting to see in some of the bureaucracies and even some of the judges that are making these decisions as well.
I agree, and there's no reason why people of, as Jeremy mentioned, of several faith traditions who hold this
Yes.
to these views on human sexuality, and the people in the LGBTQ community. There's no reason why these people can't peacefully coexist.
Yes.
You can have religious liberty and comply with the laws of this country.
Sure.
Our clients that we've defended in court on issues like this, that's all they were asking for was the right to live their life according to their faith. The Kleins in Oregon, our bakers in Oregon that we represent, they referred the couple that came to them to another baker, but that wasn't good enough for the state of Oregon.
Yeah.
It was, you will be made to think one way. You will be made to do one thing by the government of the state of Oregon. And that should concern people, even if you're not particularly religious. A government putting a private business out of business, essentially, penalizing them $135,000 and imposing what amounted to a gag order, telling them you can't even speak about these beliefs that you hold. A government putting someone out of business because they don't like what they think should be worrisome to people across America, regardless of religious affiliation or lack thereof of any religious affiliation.
And it does seem to me, Jeremy, that we are in a situation right now. It's more than just Christian. If you're an Orthodox Christian, or maybe an Orthodox Jew, or you're even an Orthodox Muslim, you would hold to, I think, a similar view about human sexuality. And it almost seems to be saying that if these rulings from the Supreme Court, and we've got a couple of them right now, of course, Jack Phillips, as well as the Pregnancy Resource Center out of California, and then your 6 cases, some of which might go to the Supreme Court. If they go the wrong way, it'd be hard for somebody that holds to traditional values, Christian, Muslim, Jew, maybe even secularist, to hold those positions because they would just be forced out of business if they were a baker or a florist or an innkeeper or a photographer, just because of some of those cases that we have.
Or even if they just followed the rules. Last week we sent a letter to the U.S. Army on behalf of a chaplain. And this chaplain who served honorably and always followed the rules, he's a veteran of several campaigns, towards the end of his career even. So he's been in this for a long time. He knows how to do it. He's sent by the North American Mission Board, which is the Southern Baptist Convention. And so he's a Southern Baptist chaplain in the U.S. Army. Well, he conducts these retreats for married couples on occasion, very small, intimate gatherings. And a same-sex couple asked to be a part of that. And there's rules for this. There's actually regulations in the Army and as well as his convention. And following the Obergefell decision from a couple years ago, the Southern Baptist Convention told its chaplains that they're not permitted to be able to facilitate retreats like this with same-sex individuals or conduct ceremonies and that kind of thing. And so he has rules that his endorsing agency puts on him and restricts him into certain acts. But the Army has made allowance for this as well, made a reasonable accommodation, which is great, to say, hey, look, we recognize that, we appreciate that, and we have a lot of people here that follow that religious belief, no problem. If that happens, then you just put them to the next retreat with an unrestricted chaplain to lead the case there. Well, that's not good enough, apparently. He follows the rules entirely, but an investigator looks into it more and recommends that they bring charges against Chaplain Squires for doing this, for simply following the rules. And since Chaplain Squires followed the rules, he's potentially going to be fired, could have his career ended for doing nothing more than following the rules of both the United States Army as well as endorsing agency, the Southern Baptist Convention, through NAM. So it's gotten to the point now where you can't even follow the rules and be okay. You're going to be punished even if the Army has particular allowances or accommodations for you to be able to live your religious beliefs as your denomination requires you to do.
You know, Lathan, I grew up with a kind of a philosophy, which I wish we would go back to, of live and let live. You know, if you can't do it, pass it on to someone else. You just mentioned the Kleins recommended they go somewhere else. We have Colonel Leland Bohannon, who said, well, I can't really sign this appreciation document for the spouse, but I'll get a 2-star general, which I thought was better than his, to sign it. You have Chaplain Squire saying, here, we'll do something else. Whatever case you have, in almost every one of those, we have pharmacists that have said, well, I can't maybe give you the abortifacient, but there's a pharmacy just 2 blocks away that you can get this at. In every case, they're providing an alternative, but that's not good enough, is it?
Correct, and that's really, I mean, one of the more dangerous trends in America right now, because that is, especially if it's done through the courts or whether it's through the Army, punishing Chaplain Squires or whatever, That is a government punishing somebody for what they think. We don't have thought crimes in this country. We never have, and we never should. That when I mentioned earlier, there is a way to peacefully coexist, and these people have tried their best to do so, but it wasn't good enough, and they were being told by, in some cases, the Army or a state government or a federal government, no, you will be forced to do this. Not just accommodate them by referring them to somebody else. You will violate what you believe in compliance with what we think is the preferred viewpoint.
That's the other thing. We've been talking about the LGBT issue versus religion. The other is that almost all these cases, the two right now in front of the Supreme Court, are both compelled speech cases. Most of your cases, Jeremy, are compelled speech cases. And when the government not only says you can't say certain things, but now the government's telling you have to say certain things or have to do certain things, that is the ultimate example of tyranny, isn't it?
Oh, it absolutely is, and it runs roughshod over the First Amendment, right? Congress shall make no law regarding the free exercise of religion, nor the establishment thereof. So, look, you got to know where these things are. You have to have wisdom in knowing what the religious liberty rights that you actually have. I'm glad we can provide some of that at firstliberty.org. I'd encourage folks to go to our Facebook page as well. First Liberty, however you find that, just search it in the little white bar at the top of the Facebook page for First Liberty. I want you to do that this weekend because there's a great video that Lathan has coming out. I think it's going to probably be on the page tomorrow.
Okay.
That'll hit
I'll
this.
Put a link as soon as it's up there.
It'll hit this separation of church and state article that he wrote online as well. So go find that, watch that video, and then share it across your network so more people know what the religious liberty rights are and how to think through these things. It's important, one thing to know, but it's important to know, and this is what Point of View has done so well since I was a kid, is teaching people how to think through these things. What is your worldview? What does it mean day in and day out? And what does it mean for your life? Think through the news that is coming across your eyes at an ever-increasing speed these days, and know how to think biblically through them as well.
Well, again, we have posted on our website here why the left is wrong about Jefferson's Wall of Separation, and it's about 4 pages if you print it out. And, of course, we have the other one. Senators are failing the religious test for office. And so, first of all, I would encourage you to read them. And then we have a share button, so you can put it on your Facebook page. And then when we get the link for your video, we can put that up there as well. And you can start some conversation and maybe some education, because it seems like we need a little bit. And if you'd like to send it to Cory Booker or Bernie Sanders or Dianne Feinstein or Dick Durbin, I'm sure that would be a good idea as well. And we're going to take a break, and we have a lot more to cover. Haven't really even talked about some of the issues in the news, so we'll start off with that, and there is a lot to cover, so we will do that. But during the break, good time to find those articles. They're available at our website, pointofview.net. Of course, we have a link to firstliberty.org. We'll be back right after this.
Why should you become a partner with Point of View Radio? Because for decades, this team has made a significant difference in lives and communities across the nation. Because America is dying for lack of biblical wisdom about life and culture. You should give because your gift will make possible cutting-edge information on issues that matter, information you won't hear anywhere else. Why? Because your gift will change lives, because you'll influence our culture with biblical truth, and because you can make a difference for the future. Our nation needs a truth team very badly. Support Point of View Radio today at pointofview.net. Click on Join the Truth Team and choose your level of support. Pointofview.net. Or call 800-347-5151, 800-347-5151. Or mail that first donation to Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221. Box 30, Dallas 75221. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed. Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of view, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. It is our weekend edition. We have a lot to cover today, and I might just go around the round table. And first of all, once again, welcome back to our conversation. Jeremy Dice, who is the senior counsel at First Liberty Institute. Also, we have Lathan Watts, who is the director of community relations with First Liberty, and really appreciate both of you joining us today. We have a lot to cover: North Korea and South Korea. I want to talk about that in just a minute. Decision coming down against Bill Cosby, and that is certainly one that fits into some of the conversation we've had about sexual harassment and sexual assaults. Matter of fact, our latest issue of Outlook magazine that is heading to your mailbox right now has to do with that whole issue, so we'll cover some of those issues. One of the articles we've posted is by our own Jeremy Dice on Senator failing the religious test. We'll get to that a little bit later. While we're talking about some of these legal issues, Alfie Evans, I think, is an illustration of what unfortunately could happen if we move towards a single-payer plan, because the British Health Service and then the court said the parents could not take this dying young man from Great Britain to Italy. You might remember Charlie Gard. They said you couldn't take him from the United States, from Great Britain to the United States. And so we'll get into some of those issues as well. And something we'll talk about in just a few minutes when we've talked about DACA, which is the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. We want to get some of the legal help around the table here that says, wait a minute, if we had an executive action that came from the previous president that created the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, why can't the current president use an executive order to rescind it? Now, again, maybe I'm just using too much common sense. We'll get into all sorts of topics along the way. But let me just for a minute mention North Korea. We won't spend a lot of time on this, but who would have guessed that you would have had the South Korean president, Moon Jae-in, and the North Korean president, Kim Jong-un, actually meet at a truce village along the demilitarized zone, and that they would shake hands and cross it? Jeremy, I'm old enough to remember when I was just a very young child when the Korean War had unfolded, and there has been tension ever since. I would never have expected this to take place, and that's exactly what we're seeing right now on our news feeds.
Yeah, to borrow a line from the president, this is huge. This is huge. I mean, it's an enormous thing, and some have called it an unintended consequence, perhaps, of I stole your line, Lathan, but an unintended consequence from President Trump's election. But I think you have to admit that the president has, and his staff, and I think there are plenty of people that deserve a lot of credit for this that'll never get the credit for it. But the fact that this is happening is enormous. This is a consequential moment that will be remembered in world history, regardless of what happens from here on out. I mean, let's just say things go back to the way they were, which will not be good. We will look back on history and remember what happened here. Or if things go and we actually see a unified Korea someday again, it will be this moment that history will turn back to look at and see again. And they will look before that as well. I mean, we'll see the images of these two leaders shaking hands and then crossing the literal physical cement border between these two nations, and look at that with the kind of a uniqueness that these historical moments kind of carry with them on the whole. But we'll see before all that what has happened. And it has largely been this presidency. Other presidencies, other State Departments have certainly contributed, perhaps there, here or there, some better than others, some worse than others. But this has been largely President Trump's foreign policy and, frankly, his sometimes too hard-nosed approach to standing up to what amounts to Kim Jong-un's bullyish tactics.
And yesterday, of course, we announced that Mike Pompeo was the new Secretary of State. Wasn't actually confirmed by as many votes as he was.
Nice first
CIA
day on the
director.
job, Mike.
Yeah.
I mean, well done. First day on the job, and you got North Korea kind of crossing the board. That's pretty good.
And he was
Set the
doing
bar
behind the
high.
scenes.
See what he does on day two.
You know, I was at a meeting about a week ago, and somebody said, "What about this? We've heard stories that he is actually meeting or met with some people in North Korea." You know, and it was sort of back channel. And I said, "Well, okay. Since again I'm the old guy around the table here, let me talk about the fact that in the Cuban Missile Crisis, it was the back channel that was established by Kennedy with the Russians that provided what could have been a military confrontation into a decision to back down from tensions." And again, as CIA director, he was already involved in some of that. And so that's something else to mention. And a lot of people say, well, Donald Trump is not very good about giving other people credit. One of his tweets today, not that I will read every one of them, actually congratulated the China president for some of those actions as well. We'll see, but and again, we know that we've been played before by North Korea, so sometimes you have
That's
to be
what I was going to
skeptical.
say. I think this, as Jeremy mentioned, it is momentous and it's historic to see that happen, and it could possibly turn out to be a tear down this wall moment for President Trump, similar to President Reagan and the Berlin Wall. So, but he should remember some other words of Reagan too, and that's trust but verify.
Trust by verify. That's a very good point.
You know, there's the jury's still out on what it will be, but there's no getting past, getting around the fact that this is a big deal. And Jeremy's right. You know, there are a lot of people who should be credited with this. I think, though, if it does turn out, the mainstream press, CNN will probably try to credit Dennis Rodman.
Yeah. That's the best line of the day. Might as well go home right now. That was great. You know, there's another thing that reminds me of, and that is since I've been doing this broadcast for more than 30 years, which is older than both of you, I suspect. But nevertheless, we remember in the late 1980s where there were some rumors that said, you know, Russia is almost broke, and if Ronald Reagan keeps building up the military, he will drive them into bankruptcy, and that might actually bring down the Iron Curtain, and it did. Well, there have been rumors for some time that North Korea is completely broke, and they're not being able to really climb out of some of the embargoes and other things. So it's possibly out of economic need. Could be that maybe one day they said, you know, after this Olympic, it felt pretty good to have a North and South Korea. I don't know. And, of course, we could be played, but we'll just see where it goes on all
Well,
this.
if that is the case, let's point out the fact that that system of government, which is an extreme socialistic, communistic environment, is on the same spectrum of many in our country today that say we ought to try that.
Yeah.
That we have the Bernie Sanders of the world that are becoming very mainstream right now, saying, "Hey, let's make sure everybody's guaranteed a job." Well, I guess they're guaranteed a job in North Korea too, or they have been over the years, but it hasn't exactly been what you might call free or something that you wanted to do. This is all too common. I want people to look at this right now and see where it inevitably ends. If in fact the Korean government has run out of money, means that they have bled their entire citizenry of every last dime they have, and there's nothing more to be gained from it. The embargoes, the sanctions have thankfully bled them dry. They've got nothing left to spend to build out their wealth and their own noblesse oblige as leaders there. So, I mean, goodness sake, this is what it inevitably leads to, and do not be deceived that it leads anywhere else.
Well, when we come back from the break, let's talk about where socialism leads. And we've got two articles that we've posted. First of all, Democrats' job guarantee. Bernie Sanders is mainstream now. We've talked a little bit about how some of these individuals that say they're going to run for the presidency have already sort of adopted Bernie Sanders' view about a single-payer plan. But then now some are also adopting his idea of jobs guarantee, which we just talked about. And then we'll go across the ocean to talk about what's happened with Elfie Evans and that issue of socialism as well. Got a lot more to cover. We'll do that right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
A number of months ago, the American Journal of Political Science issued a correction to a previous study. What was their error? The journal reversed its conclusion that conservative individuals exhibited traits associated with psychotism. They admitted that the interpretation of the coding was exactly reversed. In other words, it was liberal individuals, not conservative individuals, that exhibited these traits. As one commentator put it, that's one heck of an oops. This finding made quite a splash in technical journals. For example, the publication Retraction Watch had the headline, "Conservative Political Beliefs Not Linked to Psychotic Traits as Study Claimed." It reported that researchers have fixed a number of papers that mistakenly reported that people with conservative beliefs exhibit traits associated with psychotism, such as authoritarianism and tough-mindedness. One article that appeared in The Cut tries to answer a very important question: why it took social science years to correct a simple error about psychotism. A PhD student in psychology at the University of Minnesota concluded that the authors had simply inverted the items in the survey. Although the article helps to explain how the error began, it doesn't really spend much time talking about why it took so long to discover the error. Is it possible that the erroneous findings that conservatives exhibit these traits was not discovered because it reinforced the bias most liberal researchers in psychology already have? On most college campuses, there is a prevailing view that conservatives are rigid, intolerant, and closed-minded. And there is also the view that liberals and progressives are flexible, tolerant, and open to new ideas. But if you spend any time at the major universities, you will often see just the opposite. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For more information about issues covered on Viewpoints, visit pointofview.net. Pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
By the way, if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212, Weekend Edition, and we are privileged to have in studio with us today Jeremy Dice and Lathan Watts, both with First Liberty. And a little bit later, we're going to get into some other topics, but I thought for just a minute, since we talked about socialism and the next booklet coming out, as a matter of fact, I mentioned so often that we have these booklets that we make available to you. Here's Sharia law, privacy and surveillance, the Second Amendment. Next one coming out is on capitalism and socialism, so it's very relevant. And one of the articles that we have actually posted here, it's entitled Democrats' Job Guarantee, Bernie Sanders is Mainstream Now. And Jeremy and Lathan, one of the things we've talked about in the past is how very quickly individuals who are thinking about running for the presidency, and we're talking about Cory Booker and Elizabeth Warren and others who in the past sort of saw Bernie Sanders as a little bit of an outlier, are adopting his views, for example, on single payer. And we're going to get more into that in just a minute when we talk about the story of Alfie Evans. But this article goes one step further and said now you have 3 Democratic senators, Bernie Sanders, I think he's running for the presidency again, Cory Booker, I know he is, he's all but announced. We'll get to some of the things he said about Mike Pompeo a little bit later, and Kirsten Gillibrand, all who are now in a position to say, you know, we not only adopt this idea of single payer or government-run health care, but now even a jobs guarantee. Now, every year I go to New York, and I always spend at least a few days in Vermont. And, okay, I know people in Vermont are maybe a little bit more socialistic, but some of them even say Bernie Sanders is a little bit too liberal for them. But when you have individuals now in other states saying, we're ready to come up with a jobs guarantee program, boy, this whole Democratic platform is turning liberal in ways right before our very eyes we never would have anticipated.
Yeah, I guess we've gone from helicopter parenting to helicopter governing. I mean, goodness sakes, you're not going to allow anybody to fail anymore. You're not going to have anybody be able to lose a job. You're going to guarantee. How are you going to do that exactly? This doesn't pass even the basic level of a common sense test on things. Most people in this country know that there is no such thing as a guarantee of a job. There's no guarantees in life in general. How do we think that there's going to be a guaranteed job? I mean, goodness sakes, we've seen what is this ultimately going to lead to? We've seen this with other sectors that are more guaranteed than others. Right or wrong, we've seen recently 2 different states having public school teachers going on strike.
Yes.
That's what guaranteed jobs is going to look like into the future if you play this out. And it'll get ultimately much, much, much worse.
Lathan, what about this? Because it says, well, they have to be jobs that are socially beneficial, don't require much in the way of skills. Oh, look for that one. Be distinct from public sector jobs and also be inessential enough that the program can grow and shrink as needed. I mean, I don't think, first of all, that could even pass the straight-face test either, can it?
Of course not. I mean, name for me one government program that's worked out exactly the way they said it was going to when they proposed it. And before I came to First Liberty, I spent a lot of years working in the political sphere and worked on trade associations, nonprofit associations. One was for the commercial construction industry, and I can tell you this is completely unnecessary. There is a crisis-level shortage of skilled craftsmen in this country. The free market will deal with this if you will let it.
Mike Rowe, call your office, right? You know?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. So, yes, this is a solution in search of a problem. And I think when you see these Democrat senators who are now adopting the Bernie Sanders approach, I think what you're seeing play out is in politics, when a party is out of power, you start to look inward and figure out, okay, what do we do to get back? And it's very hard for people to be objective about themselves. And so a lot of times they will land on, well, we didn't really get our message out, and that's why we lost. Well, no, maybe it was you got your message out, and the people didn't like your message.
That's right.
But you saw how well Bernie Sanders did in the primary and how some of his supporters would say it had to be fixed for Hillary to beat him in the primary, right? These senators are not going to let anyone get to the left of them.
Nobody's getting to the left of them.
And so it pushes their party further and further left, whereas years ago, this guy was an outlier, and we would laugh about the crazy socialists from Vermont.
Bernie.
Now it's mainstream thought in their party.
When I go to Vermont, I feel the burn, but other than that, I don't feel it too many other places except where I was born in Berkeley, California. I do run into it there. But this article here said left-wing critics of moderate Democrats, like right-wing critics of moderate Republicans, tend to be especially influential in the primaries, the point you're making. It's a race to the left, and as one individual points out, Democrats are taking the basic building blocks of Sanders' political philosophy and running with them. Okay, I just admitted I was from Berkeley, and I have friends still in some of these progressive areas around the country, and I go to New York, and I go to Vermont, and I go to Oregon, and I go to places that are pretty secular. I'll tell you what's next. Not only jobs guarantee, but guaranteed income. Because the argument, Jeremy, is now with robots, we may not necessarily be able to provide enough jobs. And so we should just free people up to pursue whatever they want to pursue in the area of the arts or music or hobbies or whatever, and we'll just guarantee them an income.
Well, goodness sakes, all these guarantees that are out there. I thought we had a guarantee in the First Amendment that you could have your free speech, your religious liberty, and all that, and yet we see how well that's done by leftists here as well. So why do we think that we will actually have the American government or any government for that matter, but in this case, the American government, capable of actually fulfilling this guarantee? What did Ronald Reagan used to say? The worst words in the world were here at your front door. I'm from the government and I'm here to help
you.
This has been a long track record of government not being able to do what they say they can. And if we need any further example, how about getting a guaranteed delivery overnight by the U.S. Postal Service? That's what we're going to guarantee to make sure that I have the ability to live and to raise a family and to make sure I put food on the table for my kids. That's not a risk I'm willing to take, and I don't think any odds makers in Vegas are willing to either.
I don't think so either. And I like what you said, Lathan, too, about just the skills gap that we have. I mentioned Mike Rowe just in passing. If you haven't seen Dirty Jobs and what he's doing now and the things he's been talking about, sometimes he's been criticized, but I do have, even when my father ran for the California Assembly, used to make the argument that we really need to not encourage every kid to go to college. We need to have some of them develop skills that they could use in construction and a variety of other areas, teach them to repair cars, teach them to do plumbing, and frankly, some of them financially do a lot better than some of those individuals that ended up with an ethnic studies degree and now are parking cars.
Absolutely. I mean, it costs a lot less to learn how to weld than it does to get a degree in underwater basket weaving or whatever it is that is the measure du jour.
Yeah.
But to advocate for this type of system, a socialist economic system, you really either have to be really ignorant or really arrogant.
Yeah.
Because you either have to look at
how about both?
Completely ignore history.
Yes.
Because you can't show me a country anywhere it's been implemented where it's worked.
Yeah.
So you either have to be completely ignorant of that, or you have to be so arrogant as to say, it's never worked because I've never been in charge of it.
Yeah, and we can do it.
And if we can do it. If you put me in charge, I can sort all this out.
Socialism isn't working in Venezuela because they just didn't do it right. Socialism didn't work very well in Russia because they just didn't do it right. So I want to get back to that, but we did have a comment a few minutes ago about China and North Korea. I do want to take this call before we move on to another topic. So let me go to California first. KNLB. Kathy, I think you wanted to talk about China and North Korea, so I wanted to get you in before we take a break.
Yes, according to what Rush Limbaugh was reporting, apparently Kim Jong-un has destroyed 2 mountains over in North Korea, and it caused an earthquake, but one of them was a volcano. And they're telling Kim Jong-un that because it's literally destroyed the area, that he better come to the table or they're going to take him out.
Well, again, you're talking about some of the geographical argument, but there was also the economic one as well. If China doesn't bail out North Korea, there's nobody else to bail out, right?
That's exactly right. One of the great quotes about socialism comes from Margaret Thatcher, who said, the problem with it is you eventually run out of other people's money.
Yes.
And I think if there's pressure on North Korea, they probably have clearly run out of their own money and maybe running out of China's money.
Yes.
And or China's looked at them and said, okay.
Yeah, you're just a bad debt. Yeah.
Exactly. And that could be a great motivator to reunify with a capitalist South Korea.
And I do believe that there's some major economic pressure. And, of course, you can turn a blind eye to the suffering in North Korea for only so long. And while we're talking about Korea, let me, as we go to a break here, we're going to be promoting a lot of things that are at First Liberty, but let me promote one of our videos. It's called Uncensored the Korean Lights, in which we talk about how if you look at the satellite photos, and we have a couple of those there, in North Korea, it's just as dark as it can be. In South Korea, it's lit up. And this picture, of course, was taken before the Olympics. And then we have an individual talking about how that, in some respects, shows the light in South Korea, spiritual light, and the darkness in North Korea as well, in terms of how that's also affected religious liberty, which is a topic we'll get back to with both of you guys in just a minute. When we come back, we're going to talk about Alfie Evans. That's another aspect of socialized medicine. All that coming up right after this.
Point of View Radio has been changing lives for a generation. Listeners have been inspired to apply themselves in all kinds of ways, to stand up as lawyers, defending the Constitution and freedom, to start Christian schools, training up a new generation, to launch ministries on college campuses, even to run for and serve in Congress. So again, what are you doing to make a positive change? One way to start today is to join the Truth Team, Truth Team 360, and help us change lives. Our nation needs a Truth Team very badly. Support Point of View Radio today at pointofview.net. Set up your monthly gift by clicking the Truth Team 360 picture and then carefully follow the directions. pointofview.net. By phone, you can give at 1-800-347-5151, 800-347-5151, or mail that first donation to Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221, Box 30, Dallas 75221. Point of View will continue after this.
You're listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Weekend edition. If you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. We've talked about everything from North Korea to Bernie Sanders. Want to get into, for just a few minutes, and won't spend a lot of time, Alfie Evans. We did talk about that yesterday, but it's another example of socialism. And also some of the legal issues, and then we'll talk about the decision on Bill Cosby, because, again, I want to get some of the lawyers involved in this. But if you're not familiar, again, we're talking about Alfie Evans, and his parents wanted to fly him to the Rome hospital. The nation of Italy was willing to cover the cost, so this was not an issue of expense. But, again, the National Health Service in England really was not for that, and so a court ruled that that would not be allowed. And if this sounds familiar, of course, we talked about this before with Charlie Gard, who is another critically ill infant who the parents wanted to bring from the UK to the United States. Now, again, the question that some people have had is simply, why? If it doesn't cost the National Health Service anything, why indeed would that be such a big issue? And so one of the reasons I posted one of these pieces from Red State is it's an attempt by Kyra Davis to say, well, that's because the National Health Service simply cannot afford the extremely expensive prospect of keeping alive a young boy. Okay, we understand that. But then why would this nation that has a proud history of freedom and democracy not allow a free citizen to spend their money to do that? And that is, she uses a really good argument. That is building a wall. You just have to build a wall, because once you would allow individuals to leave a socialist system, others would want to leave a socialist system. And, of course, look at how embarrassing, as is said in one of the later pieces here, if Alfie were allowed to leave England, again, allowed to leave a free country, even as I write the words they feel absurd, and then found a successful treatment. Now, of course, that probably was not going to happen. He was in a very traumatic situation, but it illustrates what we might head towards, and that is the possibility with a socialist system of saying, we know what is best for you. We, as bureaucrats, will determine what kind of treatment you should receive, and you cannot leave the system in order to get a different kind of treatment. Lathan, what about this? This is, I think, an illustration of some of the dangers of socialism.
Of course. It's heartbreaking to watch that. I have two daughters. Nothing would stop me from getting treatment for my kids.
Yes.
And so you put yourself in the shoes of those parents. I just can't even imagine. I know what struck me initially when I first saw this story was the contrast between this and the great fanfare of the newest member of the royal family being born.
Yes.
And I thought to myself, does anyone in England does anyone in the world doubt that if the newest little royal had the exact same problem, that he wouldn't be allowed to go to Rome to get better treatment? And anytime you have a socialist system in place, there are two groups of people. There are the governing and the governed.
Mm-hmm. And
it never works out well for the governed.
Mm-hmm.
It's all fine and dandy for the people who are running the system. And I thought, the contrast was so striking to me to see. I don't have anything against the royal family, but to see that, and with such great fanfare, this new little baby born, and then here's this family that is suffering under a socialist healthcare system. It always comes down to who's governing and who's governed.
Yes.
When you're talking about socialism.
And we have somewhat of that gap even in the United States, but it was really obvious when you look at the UK. But, Jeremy, what about this? Because we've already talked about the dangers of socialism, and here's another example. If you allow people to go outside the system, socialism has to work because everybody's in the system and it's supposed to provide health care for everybody, but not necessarily quality health care, because as soon as you start doing that, you end up with all sorts of difficulties and people trying to escape the system. That's why you got to build a wall.
This is the country that raised Winston Churchill, who said often enough that freedom is a great thing, defended freedom to the core, fought on the beaches literally to defend against the encroach of socialism and Marxism. And now, is this a free country? Is England actually committed to its ideals of freedom? Think of all the freedoms that have been denied here. The freedom of parents to raise their children in the way that they see fit. The freedom to achieve the level of health care that you desire and not what the government desires for you. Freedom of movement. There were at one point police officers lined up outside the hospital to prevent Alfie and his parents from leaving that hospital. My goodness, there could be many more freedoms. The freedom to drink a glass of water for 6 hours was denied to this child. The freedom of due process in the courts of law were denied to this child and have been denied to this child and continue to be denied in some instances. When the government begins to take over even small parts of your life and determine what you are entitled to and are not entitled to, it is not a very long slide to the point where they control every aspect of your life. And if we are not vigilant in this country to prevent things like this from happening, because they sound so enticing, they're so tempting to say, well, yeah, we could solve this issue or we could solve that issue by this grand utopian promise. If we're not diligent in fighting off those things, we will lose our freedoms. And if you need any example of how that looks, Alfie's a great example of that. But for goodness sakes, if you haven't heard us say it too much already, we're being denied many of those things in our religious liberty already. Yeah. What is to stop this kind of thing from happening here? And I submit that there's very little to stop.
Well, that's one of the reasons why some people are concerned about Obamacare or a single-payer plan, because one of the individuals who was sort of the architect of what is called Obamacare or the Affordable Care Act was a man by the name of Ezekiel Emanuel. And if that last name sounds familiar, his brother is Rahm Emanuel, who's the mayor of Chicago. And Ezekiel Emanuel in New England Journal of Medicine has this kind of chart. It looks like a bell-shaped chart, and that is, he says, we sometimes, with these young children, and Alfie is a good example, have congenital abnormalities. They have certain problems, and so we spend a disproportionate amount of health care, scarce health care dollars and resources on them, and maybe that's not productive. And then he goes to the other end of life and looks at those people over the age of 75, where after they get older, and I'm getting into that realm eventually, where we spend a disproportionate amount there. And his argument is we shouldn't really spend it at the margins, at the early parts of life or the end of life, because if we have a healthy child, unlike Alfie, and we spend a little bit on immunizations, or they break a bone, or treat them for various kinds of diseases, they're going to have a lot of productivity all through life. And I don't know, but Lathan, that sounds a little bit like, we just need to allow people that are useless eaters, not productive members of our society, we should just deny them health care because we don't benefit as a society. It's very utilitarian.
Very. It looks at people as a commodity.
Yeah.
I mean, it's as simple as that. And that's why it doesn't work. This country's founded on the rights of the individual, and that there's dignity and beauty in every human life. And this is why folks that want to advocate for bigger government, more government as the solution to all your problems are so keen to get involved in healthcare, because like Jeremy said, healthcare, your health, there's not much in your life that doesn't eventually have some impact on your health.
Well said.
And if the government is going to pay for all of that healthcare, then they're going to start telling you how to run your life because it impacts their checkbook. Okay. Leave out the fact that their checkbook is your money. It's not their money. It's the taxpayers' money, and they very rarely see it that way. But yes, the system absolutely looks at people as a commodity.
Let me come back to Jeremy's comment, too, about religious liberty. David French posted a piece, and I should have put it up today, but it just came about a few hours ago. But he makes the connection to religious liberty, because he said, how could this kind of mindset come here? And he said, because really our declaration is based on the fact that really there is fundamentally a religious element to America's founding. The primacy of the laws of nature and nature's God is clear and explicit, and also that the state is inherently and inescapably subordinate to those laws, existing mainly to protect the rights that God grants. But then he points out that now we have millions of secularized Americans who have quite a different view as well, and so the religious element rings false and hollow to them. So just as we lose our religious liberty because of our secularized society, he's making the case, and I think it makes some sense, we could also lose our idea of inherent rights, which is really one of the foundational issues at stake here with Alfie Evans, don't you think?
Absolutely, and it goes to exactly what Lathan was saying a moment ago, that when we have the government, a centralized force, determining what is worth it and what is not, they can decide whether or not our individual rights are worth it or whether they're not. I thought the piece you did post at Red State, they say it so well at the end of the article. The author writing that, Kira Davis, says here, ask anyone here in the United States, and 9 times out of 10, they'll tell you they'd give their last dollar, sell their last possession, go into debt for the rest of their lives to save their life of someone they love, rather than sit helpless as their government sentences that person to death because it just isn't worth it.
Great line. We'll be right back.
Many tributes to former First Lady and First Mom Barbara Bush describe her 1990 Wellesley graduation speech, which placed her, at least according to the Washington Post, at the center of a national debate about the nature of feminism that would continue for decades. Feminists claim their movement is about making choices, but 150 Wellesley students protested that Mrs. Bush had, quote, gained recognition through the achievements of her husband. Not quite the Wellesley way. In the end, she wowed the crowd, telling them that, quote, you are a human being first, and those human connections with spouses, with children, with friends, are the most important investments you will ever make. In a recent National Review article, Heather Wilhelm contrasts what she calls today's sad feminism with the values exhibited in Barbara Bush's life. She writes that as Mrs. Bush rose above society's dream, so did Tammy Jo Schultz, the Southwest airline pilot who just last week guided a crippled plane to a safe landing after the mid-air explosion of one of its engines. Heather Wilhelm points out that Captain Schultz, age 56, learned to fly in the Navy at a time when the idea of women flying fighter jets often earned dismissive scoffs. Growing up near an Air Force base, she watched jets in action and fell in love. Ms. Wilhelm says modern feminism tells women there is one way to think, to the left, and the Barbara Bush-like dream of being a full-time mother and devoting time to family is often brushed aside as less worthy than the aspiration to be a scientist or an engineer or a CEO. A better feminism would applaud women who find ways to make life better for those whom God places in their orbit. This feminism would empower a woman, perhaps a pilot, perhaps a first lady, who carries out with calm and grace, and often with nerves of steel, the roles life tosses her way. For Point of View, I'm Penna Dexter.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. It is our weekend edition. Jeremy and Lathan in studio with us, and one of the articles we have posted is "This is the real reason Britain won't release Alfie Evans to Italy." And you were giving us that last set of quotes there, which I thought were really powerful.
Yeah, let me go back through it again because it's just important for us to hear this. This is a Canadian author who understands the universal health care system of her country and the United Kingdom as well. And she says, to anyone who echoes such sentiments, and the sentiments was, I'd rather pay higher taxes for free health care than deal with the American health care system, they often say. To anyone who echoes such sentiments, she says, let me point to poor, sweet Alfie Evans and his helpless parents as to why most Americans still abhor the idea of the government having the last say in whether or not you get the treatment you need to live. Ask anyone here in Canada, 9 times out of 10, they'll tell you they'd give their last dollar, sell their last possession, go into debt for the rest of their lives to save the life of someone they loved rather than sit helpless as their government sentences that person to death because it just isn't, quote, worth it. It's never worth it, she says, until it's your child. When government controls your health care, they ultimately control what your life is worth to the people who love you.
Yes. So again, part of the problem is that you are turning over these decisions to bureaucrats. And one of the stories that I've told before, and it's interesting enough that Ben Shapiro told it as well, comes from a former U.S. Senator here, Phil Gramm, as he was talking about this issue. Now, it's funny because I've heard Phil Gramm tell a story about health care and the one that Ben Shapiro talked about education, but I'll use the health care one because I think it's more accurate, in which he was talking about health care because I think he was actually challenging what at that time was called Hillary Care back in the early 1990s. And so he was saying, well, I just have some real concerns because I care more about my children's health than anyone else. And the bureaucrat at the testimony said, oh, no, Senator Gramm, we care about your children as much as you do. And he looked at him and said, yeah, what are their names? And the point he was making is, only I really know what my children need, and only I know what's worth it. And when you as a bureaucrat, a heartless bureaucrat, unelected bureaucrat, a person that is in Washington, D.C., that probably doesn't even know any of my kids making decisions about that, I don't want to turn that over. And it does seem to me that we've had a couple of people writing about that over the last couple of decades, reminding us that this is kind of the road to tyranny, isn't it?
Well, I saw on Twitter, and you may have seen this too, someone say, you want to ask me why I'm entitled under the Second Amendment to my choice of weapon, an AR-15 or something else, because of this. Because if you tell me I'm not going to be able to get on my plane to take my sick child to Italy to get him healed, I'm going to tell you I'm going to be getting on that plane. And you're not going to stop me, government or anybody else. I'm going to get on that plane, and be warned I will. You know, I go back to this article. I'm glad you found this article, Kerby. It's a really poignant article, really well done, and it ends so beautifully as well. She says, sadly, Alfie and little Charlie Gard before him, and remember that story as well, they're doomed to be the sacrificial lamb at the altars of pride and socialism. She says, you'll never convince me that this is right in any way. Never. Because what this is nothing short of real, actual, genuine evil. Wow.
And again, she is in Canada, and I've had some of our listeners from Canada say, well, but this has worked really well. You know, I had a cold and I went in there and didn't have to pay anything and walked right out. And I've said before, you know, if you're in Canada or you're in the United Kingdom or a number of other places where you have government-run health care and you've got a cold or you've got a sinus infection, you've got a broken arm, it works real well. But I'll guarantee you that if you need a heart valve changed, or you maybe need a heart transplant or kidney transplant, or you need to go on kidney dialysis, that's when you would realize that those cost-constrained principles and policies are going to actually guarantee that you will eventually die.
And you don't even have to look. I mean, this is an extreme example from the UK and the Canadian healthcare system that we often look to. But even right here in America, ask anyone who gets their healthcare from the VA.
Yeah.
Ask how their customer experience is.
Yes.
And now there's been efforts for many years to improve that, and I think there are maybe some improvements coming. But that's government-run healthcare.
Yeah.
Right there for you.
And again, what Bernie Sanders and some of the others want to say, well, we want Medicare for all. Well, most people tend to like Medicare. Of course, there's a difference. Medicare, I paid into it, so I should get it back. If you really said what health care is really going to be, it's VA for all. And as soon as you say that, a lot of people say, this single-payer plan doesn't sound so good. VA for all. As a matter of fact, the latest individual that was going to be in the VA had to step down for all sorts of reasons, and we'll see, but I think that's a good illustration.
And again, the bottom line with all these things, the common denominator here is a loss of freedom. If we're supposed to live in a free country, if Alfie Evans is supposed to be living in a free country in Great Britain, Why is he not permitted to leave with his family? How does a judge have authority to say, please stand at the door, keep him locked inside, and don't let him leave? How is that border an open border to the Evans family? It certainly is not, and that cannot be the case. And the evil here that this author speaks about is not so much, and though it is, of a judge in the country saying you're not allowed to have this health care. The great evil that is at play here is the fact that they would assert themselves over this family and deny them the right to have freedom. That's the individual human right that is supposed to be guaranteed to this child and his family that is being denied. We get upset when we hear about socialistic medicine and things like that, not because we're cold-hearted people that don't want to see people get healthy. We are upset because we see a loss of freedom that every heart ought to be able to yearn for and receive.
Yeah. And again, you look at things like the VA, and certain drugs are on the formulary and certain ones aren't, and certain things can be treated, certain can't. Let's at least take one phone call before we run out of time in this segment. We'll come back to some others in a minute. We'll go to Georgia this time. David, I think you have a question for our panel.
Hi, yes, I do. Thanks for taking my call. So you guys did a great job talking about, how we need to be active and not just, talk about these things, but really get involved and push back to keep our freedoms. How would you distinguish that kind of activism with the activism of other Christians who kind of been labeled social justice warriors for fighting against, domestic and police brutality and things like that? How would you say that that's different?
No, I think we should be active in a couple of ways. First of all, during a campaign right now, there are going to be all sorts of people asking for your vote. So I think this story of Alfie Evans, or in the past Charlie Gard, say, you're talking about wanting government to take over more and more of our authority, more and more of our decision making. What do you feel should be the parents' rights? So I think that's a good question. Just as I suspect you want to ask questions of, do you feel like the police have overreacted in some of those situations? I mean, it seems to me that those are legitimate questions to ask candidates, and right now they're asking for your vote. Many of you are still in states where there's primaries, and all of us are going to have a chance to vote for, 435 members of the House of Representatives, 35 U.S. senators, and hundreds, almost thousands, I guess, of different governor's races, state Senate races, state representative races. We should be asking those questions.
Yeah, the candidates themselves, but we should also be sitting down within our communities as well, figuring out at the individual level, at the community level, how to solve these issues, and not asking big brother government to be the end-all be-all, because we understand, as the founders understood, that government itself, centralizing that into one form, is only going to tend to corrupt. It will never tend to create more righteousness. It will only go to the point of corruption further. So if you're concerned with all the police failings that we have today, and there are issues that we as a country must work through on those points, the solution is not more and bigger government. It is actually less and fewer government, and allowing the people at the smallest circle of that influence to be the ones that actually guard that. That starts in the family unit. It builds out to the neighborhood, to the city, the state, and then to the federal government. But it should not go to the biggest unit first and trickle down.
Yes. We need to take a break, and when we come back, we'd love to get some comments around the round table about the verdict on Bill Cosby. Also, a verdict about DACA, Deferred Action on Childhood Arrivals. All that coming up right after this.
Is religious freedom still a cornerstone of the Republic, or has it effectively been crushed by the forces of tolerance? America needs Christians to be informed and as unified as possible, applying God's wisdom to civic life. Point of view can be a key part of a successful mission. I believe in America. I believe God wants His best for us. We can face whatever the world throws at us as long as we stand together. If you have not signed on, please do it now. Support Point of View Radio today at pointofview.net. Set up your monthly gift by clicking the Truth Team 360 picture and then carefully follow the directions. Pointofview.net. By phone, you can give at 1-800-347-5151. 800-347-5151. Or mail that first donation to Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221. Box 30, Dallas 75221. Or call us 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of view, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
If you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212, Weekend Edition. We're privileged to have in studio with us Jeremy Dice as well as Lathan Watts, and they are both with First Liberty. We'll talk more about First Liberty before the end of the hour. Also get into two of the articles that have been written by them as well. But I've got one call left over from the last hour. Let me pick that one up before we get into the issue of the verdict on Bill Cosby, DACA, the Deferred Action on Childhood Arrivals, and then also a couple of very interesting things on senators failing the religious test and even people that misunderstand the separation of church and state. But let's go to South Carolina this time, WAGP. And Dennis, I think you wanted to talk about single-payer health care. What would you like to add to our conversation?
Well, really, thank you for taking my call. I don't necessarily have anything to add. I just have a question.
Go for it.
This is a political thing, this single-payer health care thing. And I just wonder, what interest do the globalists, who have a great deal of influence in our politics, what interest do they have in this single-payer health care? And can I ask an off-the-wall question?
Go for it.
Why is the lawyer who's deciding between Michael Cohen, and the FBI, their issues on what papers get looked at and what don't, why is the lawyer the judge,
Kimba Wood,
make those decisions? Yeah, why is she there, since she has such close connections to George Soros?
Yeah, there you go. And those are all good questions. First of all, why, if you believe in more government, if you believe that government is the solution to your problems, would you want to promote single-payer health care? And I think, Jeremy, last hour, you gave us a pretty good answer for that, and Lathan did as well. The more if there's one place where I can control individuals, it is to control their health care. Lathan, wouldn't you agree with that?
Right, because if you get into this notion of, well, the government is paying for it, then the government has the right to tell you X, Y, Z. And there's not much you can do in life that doesn't impact your health in one way or another.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, every type of human activity they could seek to regulate, because they could say, well, that leads to this, which the government then has to pay for your health care to fix. So therefore, we're going to tell you can't do that.
Yes. So if I want to control you, controlling health care is one of the best ways to do so, right?
It is one of the ways in which government can limit your freedom. And that was the whole point, right, is that the founding fathers in our country looked across the entire history of the world, as well as the current government structures in that time period, and said, look, we are not free. That men and women of this country are, as human beings, have the right to be free. And so we need to divest government of all but the essential elements of what is necessary to have a government. And that is primarily to provide for the common defense, to make sure that people aren't cheaters at business and at other things like that, and allow individuals otherwise to pursue happiness, as the Declaration of Independence put it, and allow people to be free. But whether it's single-payer health care or anything else, it is great giving an opportunity to the government or let's put it this way, it's a better way for us to centralize power, and that's never good. When we diversify power amongst the people, it's a significantly better thing for everybody. As I said at the end of the last hour, when we allow the smallest unit of power to reign at the local level, if you allow mom and dad to be the right authority over the family, and then only give out certain amount of powers beyond that, we function better. We provide more freedom when we do that. Now, I will take up Dennis's second question about the Cohen lawyers. I don't know about everything that he was saying in that, but I will say this. As an attorney myself, I find it very frustrating that we have a judge. Frustrating is the wrong term. There's whatever harder is harder than frustrating. This is what I find myself being.
Let's go find a thesaurus here.
Yeah, someone find me a synonym for that one. But here's the reality. You have a judge that ordered an attorney to reveal
Unbelievable.
His client.
Yes.
That just, I don't know if he's right or wrong in terms of representing Cohen or Sean Hannity or Trump. I have no idea, and I don't have an opinion on that. But I do have an opinion on the fact that we have a judge requiring an attorney to violate his attorney-client relationship. If you've seen the movie The Firm, you know what I'm talking about. Remember that last scene where Cruz finally goes into the syndicate or whoever the mob was at the time there and says, I have got to take that information with me to the grave. Well, apparently not so much anymore.
Yes. Well, and some people are suggesting maybe the word should be maddening, but whatever word you want to use. And again, the point he's making is Kimball Wood, who is the judge, actually officiated at George Soros' wedding. Now, that is not necessarily a violation, but it reminded me of how Ruth Bader Ginsburg officiated at a same-sex wedding before she ruled on the issue of same-sex marriage. And it sometimes makes sense, and I've got two lawyers in front of me here, for a judge to recuse himself or herself because of conflicts. And I just am noticing more and more that the Supreme Court justices are not recusing themselves. I mean, Scalia did, I think, once, and a few others, but it just seems like, oh, that's okay, I'm objective, and so I will not recuse myself for any decision. So the chances that Kimball Wood would recuse herself because of her connections probably slim and none, right?
Yeah, I joined a research project on this in law school, as a matter of fact, looking at that very issue about whether or not we should allow judges to, because right now the system is basically self-restraint. You're going to have to self-impose yourself to recuse yourself, and there's some good reasons for that, frankly, and I won't go into the history of why that would be. But it does leave a bit of the fox guarding the hen house. In fact, there's a large article on that very title on this issue. So it's interesting how that plays out here. But at the end of the day, whether or not this judge can or should be sitting in this particular case, whether there's a conflict of interest there, that could serve as grounds for an appeal, and sometimes that does, in fact, happen. But there is no way to appeal the revelation and the forced revelation of attorney-client information. That is now out there and is done, and there are reasons why we have that information. If we cannot communicate confidentially to our clients, if our clients cannot communicate confidentially to us, then the promise of the Fourth Amendment is gone.
Yes,
and that is a dangerous, frightening and dangerous situation.
Yeah. So again, we'll use the word maddening. By the way, one of the other comments here, I had a friend that went to the VA for a broken tooth. It only took 13 days to get it fixed. So, here we go again. Let's take a break. When we come back, I want to talk about the decision of guilty for Bill Cosby. And I might just mention, for those of you watching online, I'm holding up our latest issue, the May issue of Outlook, Understanding the Me Too Movement in an Over-Sexualized Culture. We have a piece by Penna Dexter called Me Too is a Mixed Bag. And then my piece on sexual harassment actually was a summary of some of the interview we did with June Hunt on sexual harassment, sexual assault, and then also my commentary on sexting is more common than you think. And I want to get some comments from our lawyers around the court here and around the table about this whole issue of Bill Cosby. And then we're going to get into another decision, it's an odd one as well, on deferred action for childhood arrivals and some other legal issues. So again, some of those articles we've posted, guilty until proven innocent, double standards. We'll get into this one on religious test and also maybe educate you a little bit about this idea of a wall of separation. And of course, we've already talked about Elfie Evans and Bernie Sanders. So all of those articles are available today on our website, pointofview.net. Let's take a break. We'll talk about the verdict on Bill Cosby right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
A number of months ago, the American Journal of Political Science issued a correction to a previous study. What was their error? The journal reversed its conclusion that conservative individuals exhibited traits associated with psychotism. They admitted that the interpretation of the coding was exactly reversed. In other words, it was liberal individuals, not conservative individuals, that exhibited these traits. As one commentator put it, that's one heck of an oops. This finding made quite a splash in technical journals. For example, the publication Retraction Watch had the headline, "Conservative Political Beliefs Not Linked to Psychotic Traits as Study Claimed." It reported that researchers have fixed a number of papers that mistakenly reported that people with conservative beliefs exhibit traits associated with psychotism, such as authoritarianism and tough-mindedness. One article that appeared in The Cut tries to answer a very important question: why it took social science years to correct a simple error about psychotism. A PhD student in psychology at the University of Minnesota concluded that the authors had simply inverted the items in the survey. Although the article helps to explain how the error began, it doesn't really spend much time talking about why it took so long to discover the error. Is it possible that the erroneous findings that conservatives exhibit these traits was not discovered because it reinforced the bias most liberal researchers in psychology already have? On most college campuses, there is a prevailing view that conservatives are rigid, intolerant, and closed-minded. And there is also the view that liberals and progressives are flexible, tolerant, and open to new ideas. But if you spend any time at the major universities, you will often see just the opposite. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For more information about issues covered on Viewpoints, visit pointofview.net. Pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Love to get your comments about this decision against legendary comedian Bill Cosby. Everybody around the table probably enjoyed his humor, and those of us that are a little bit older remember hearing him on records and on CDs and watching him in I Spy and certainly on the Cosby Show. But verdict came down yesterday. We did talk about it briefly, but we really haven't gotten into some of the legal issues. But 3 counts of felony aggravated indecent assault. Each one could be 10 years, could spend 30 years in prison. Of course, it will be appealed, no doubt about that. But even Gloria Allred, who represents almost 24 individuals out of the dozens and dozens of individuals that have now come forward, was a little bit surprised by this decision. And there are a couple of questions about why it could be appealed. One is that there wasn't just this one individual who was actually testifying, Andrea Constan, but others were allowed to testify as well. But I'd love to go around the roundtable and just get some comments. Any thoughts about this decision?
Well, I'm glad we can talk about all the comfortable topics now.
Yes.
And discuss these here. But look, I think I grew up watching Bill Cosby. I grew up watching the Cosby Show, as I'm sure a lot of others did. I remember the vinyl that we used to listen to, the record of Bill Cosby himself, and my parents would even censor parts of that, as they should have, as we were listening to that. But Cosby, the Fat Albert Gang, and all that, there was some great history there and some great art that's going. So what do we do with Bill Cosby now? Look, I think we've got to recognize that you can appreciate some of the art that was there without endorsing the man necessarily. And this has been, unfortunately, the push-pull for most of artistic history, where we've had some truly vile human beings that have created some brilliant art that is out there. And so we do that constantly. This is part of where you've got to put your worldview on and be able to think through things carefully with that. What Bill Cosby has done here, or what he's now been convicted of having done, is despicable. It is evil, and it is wrong, and we should denounce it in no uncertain terms whatsoever. The courts are going to have to sort out if this jury was at all tainted or if it was presented right or wrong information. That's going to be left to the appellate process. But the very fact that there is some smoke indicating some fire underneath these allegations here, and a jury of his peers has determined that there is, in fact, truth to these allegations, it's wrong, it's horrible, and it is against the dignity of human beings, and certainly against the dignity of our nearest neighbors, our women in our country here. And if it is Bill Cosby or Harvey Weinstein, we tend to have a warmer spot on our heart for Bill Cosby because we liked his humor. Weinstein looks like a jerk. It's easier to not like that guy, but it's a little harder to not like Bill Cosby. But they've both committed a grand and horrid evil that we ought to condemn repeatedly and stand up for those that have been oppressed by both of these men. This is not how men are to act, but this is evidence of a great fall, not in their own lives, although they have. That's a little f fall, but this is evidence of the capital F fall in the lives of these men. And so it's important for us, especially as parents, as you sort through these issues here, to remind your kids that the grip of evil, the grip of the fall, the effect of the fall and the effect of the curse has been to pervert all of human history and every human heart. And there is only one solution for that, and you'll have to go and talk to your pastor about exactly what that means, and you hear it here often enough on Point of View. I don't need to reiterate it all. But it is an example, again, that we may have a public persona of one thing, but there is a private heart that only God knows himself.
Well said, yes. Any comments, Lathan?
I don't know that I can say it any better than Jeremy just did. Whether it's in entertainment or history or even characters in Scripture, there are heroes and heroes fall.
Yeah,
and it is a undeniable truth in life. And just like Jeremy said, we may not like this story because we liked the Bill Cosby we thought we knew.
Yes. Well, and again, we have this Me Too article just coming out. It's a series of articles. And again, unfortunately, we don't have Penna Dexter today, because I always like to have a woman around the table when we're talking about these issues. But she's at a wedding, and Debbie Georgiadis is out in the month of April. And I think Chelsea's in the midst of doing some brief or something like that. Yeah, and
it's helpful to have a female voice on these things for some obvious reasons. But I think it's important as for us as men to come out here and say, I disagree with Harvey Weinstein. And I find Bill Cosby's actions absolutely despicable and deplorable, drugging women and making them unconscious and doing unspeakable things to them while they're in that incapacitated state. I hope the ladies in my life understand that is something that I would never contemplate. And I hope that we can all say that as men ourselves, not only to say that we don't want to put ourselves in any one of those positions ever, but we want to treat women with the same dignity and respect that they deserve, that their Creator gave to them. And we ought to be intentional about that. I've got 4 young men that I'm raising. Mm-hmm. Lathan has 2 young ladies that he's raising. There are implications in these stories that we've got to teach around the kitchen table. For my men, it's going to be to point to these guys and say, this is not the kind of man you are to be. Look at your grandfather as an example of a man who stayed faithful to his wife for over 50 years. Look at your great-grandfather who literally had to leave the army early because he had a broken heart from being away from his sweetheart. These are the kinds of stories that I want my boys to know, that they go and live that kind of honorable life.
Let's take some phone calls along the way. We'll head up to Salem, Massachusetts. There we go. George, do I have you on the line?
Yep, I'm here.
Okay, what would you like to add to our conversation today?
Well, I have two comments. They call Cosby the America's dad, and they also have to comment that he was not ever displaying any Christianity in his life. I never saw any sign of it, so I couldn't really be a true role model for Christians. Secondly, he said something very revealing when he said, well, these things, it's like giving a woman a drink, and it does not show that depraved, sometimes you call it the frat boy mentality.
Yeah, justifying it, yeah. Good
Just
point.
a horrible way to look at women and look at the use of different ways to ruin them.
Well, again, I appreciate your comments, and again, it's so. I'm beginning to wonder if we're prophetic, because a while back we put out an issue saying that we thought trade was going to be a big deal, and just as it hit the stands, that's when all the trade issues came up. Now this one's hitting just as, of course, we have the decision down for Bill Cosby. And I guess one other thing I might just raise before the end of this segment, and that is, of course, we've got something that I've posted here on guilty until proven innocent, and it has to do with, of course, the Mueller investigation. But some people have said, are we ever going to get to a point where then just an accusation is enough? When we have Bill Cosby and you have dozens and dozens of women coming forward, we know that is definitely true. You have, let me take the other extreme. Tucker Carlson a while back had a woman accuse him of sexual harassment, and it was a woman he had never even met. But again, just thinking of having to, because you're a public figure, defend yourself against a woman who you've never met, obviously never had an interaction with, maybe never been in the same room with, the accusation he was able to fend off pretty quickly. But again, that's we always say you're innocent till proven guilty. Bill Cosby has been proven guilty, but again, just another aspect of something to think about as well.
And that goes to the conversation we were having before the break about if we don't have judges that are willing to uphold the rule of law and to be impartial in the proceedings ahead of them, then yes, we are guilty until proven innocent. And that is not the standard of this country. That is not the standard of the Constitution, that we are to presume to be innocent. But if we have judges that are perverting justice on the bench, that are making a sham of their courtrooms here, ordering attorneys to give up client information to breach confidentiality and that sacred trust between attorney and client, then how can the people feel assured that justice is in fact going to be done? You're going to find more people trying to provide even more evidence of false accusations because they can. They can have their 15 seconds of fame, or 15 minutes of fame, whatever it might be, and try to win in that regard in the court of public opinion, regardless of the truth. If we abandon as a society in the courts of law that are supposed to be the defenders of it, the rule of not only law, but of the role of capital T truth in our world, then of course we're going to have a society that is not going to be beneficial for anyone.
Reminds me of Isaiah chapter 5, where it talks about good evil and evil good, and it goes on to say where the innocent are going to jail and the guilty go free. You can have a situation in other countries and sometimes even in our own country where that takes place. So we need to take a break. I can see a few more of you might want to address the issue of Bill Cosby, but I also want to come back to another issue since we're talking with two lawyers today about a ruling that came down from Judge John Bates, a federal district court there in the District of Columbia, having to do with DACA, Deferred Action of Childhood Arrivals. If an executive order by the previous president, Barack Obama, created DACA, isn't it possible that an executive order now by President Donald Trump could remove it? Well, Judge John Bates, in his inscrutable wisdom, says no, it has to continue on. And there are some legal issues involved with that, too. So we'll talk about that. We'll also take some more phone calls, 1-800-351-1212. We'll take those calls right after this.
Why should you become a partner with Point of View Radio? Because for decades, this team has made a significant difference in lives and communities across the nation. Because America is dying for lack of biblical wisdom about life and culture. You should give because your gift will make possible cutting-edge information on issues that matter, information you won't hear anywhere else. Why? Because your gift will change lives, because you'll influence our culture with biblical truth, and because you can make a difference for the future. Our nation needs a truth team very badly. Support Point of View Radio today at pointofview.net. Click on Join the Truth Team and choose your level of support. Pointofview.net. Or call 800-347-5151. 800-347-5151. Or mail that first donation to Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221. Box 30, Dallas 75221. Point of View will continue after this.
You're listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Final half hour. If you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Jeremy and Lathan in studio with us. We're going to talk about some of their articles before the end of this hour, but let me go to California, KCBC. And Mary Lou, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Oh, hi. The comment that I wanted to make about Cosby, why did these young girls go by themselves to this grown man's apartment or house by themselves?
Well, and Garrett, there is a lesson to be passing on to your children. I have two girls, and Lathan has two daughters, and I'd say, there are circumstances that you may want to avoid. And for your boys, we might also say, the Mike Pence standard or the Billy Graham standards is a good thing to think about as well.
Looking wiser and wiser every day, isn't it?
Yeah, so, yes, and so maybe they assume some things that were naive. Maybe they hope for some things. I don't know. I mean, and again, I don't blame the victims.
Exactly.
We got to be real careful to blame the victims, but at the same time, there is the idea of prudence, and I think that's, again, why I wish I had Penna Dexter here, because she wrote a piece a couple weeks ago that got into that and said, look, we're not blaming the victims, but a wise and discerning man or woman won't put themselves in circumstances that could be dangerous. Is that fair?
That's true. And again, I want to underscore what you said. Let's not blame the victim on that. Why these women went alone is really immaterial to the evil act that Bill Cosby committed when they did.
Right.
And so let's keep the focus on the bad guy here. Bill Cosby was wrong. He should not have done that. It was an evil thing for him to have done if, in fact, these allegations, as convicted, are proven to be true, and it appears to be. Same thing with Harvey Weinstein and others. They are wicked, they are depraved, and they are evil acts, and we should roundly condemn them.
Yes. And again, Penna Dexter's piece really gets into that a little bit more, to how to think about those issues. And so I appreciate you bringing that up. But again, let's be careful, because it was its evil intent. And also, again, let's acknowledge something else. Sometimes when we look at those perpetrators, a lot of them had power over those individuals. Even today, Tom Brokaw is in the news, for example, and others have been in the news. And when it's your boss, or when it's an individual that runs a movie studio where your career is on the line, maybe you would not exercise the best judgment. So let's, again, place the evil where it belongs, place the blame where it belongs, and that's on those individuals that have been outed by the Me Too movement. So, very good. Brunelda in California, thank you for joining us today. What's your point of view?
Hi, thank you. One comment and a question. For years, there has been injustices for African American Black people, and I'm all for if he did it, whoever, I don't care who it is, white, black, Chinese, or Mexican, or whatever it is, Asian, whatever it is, I'm all for justice for anybody who commits a heinous crime against women. So with that said, like I said, that there has been injustices for African American people for over 200 years. And with that, why isn't now our president being held to the same standards when it comes against committing crime against women as everyone else? Right now, he's the only one that's getting away with this. Everyone else is in the news, and something's being done about it. But no one is saying or doing anything about what our president has done to a bunch of women that have come forward.
And again, first of all, we have a history of, let's take another white president, that would be Bill Clinton, and that action was taken. And I don't think the president should be held to a different standard. It's kind of back to the point we made just a few minutes ago when we were talking about Elfie Evans, that we shouldn't live in a world where those who actually make the laws are exempt from the laws that the rest of us have to live under.
Certainly not. I mean, that's one of the fundamental concepts that's made this country great, is that no one is above the law, that we are governed by the rule of law, not the rule of men. And regardless of your position, if you commit a crime like this, you ought to be held to account for it.
And don't forget that these were allegations that stem from the early 80s, late 70s, if I recall correctly. I mean, these are allegations that are older than I am. And justice does not sleep. At some point, these actions will catch up with you. Look, I don't know all the allegations that have gone against President Trump here. I suspect some of them are probably not true. Maybe some are true. Then they have to debate whether or not are these voluntary acts or are they involuntary ones that are actually illegal. There's a whole lot of things. But what I do know is what my dad used to say: don't ever assume that evil, you'll get away with it.
Yeah.
That will catch up with you. Those lies catch up with you. It caught up with Bill Cosby. If President Trump is required to be held accountable, I assume that at some point those actions will catch up with him as well. I don't think it's fair for us to equate the fact that President Trump has, quote, gotten away with evil acts as having actually gotten away with evil acts. They may catch up with him. They certainly have caught up with him in this campaign or in the campaigns in his early stages of his presidency. It certainly hasn't been easy going, at least for him on those things. How would you like to have your history put out on the newspaper every single day? I certainly would prefer to avoid a lot of that stuff. But if they have, in fact, been criminal acts, I suspect once we get over Russia claims, certainly I wouldn't be surprised to see some of those things popping up and seeing the tactic taken to go to the court on those issues as well.
Again, one more point I would like to make, and that is the vice president, Mike Pence, has a philosophy that says, it's just as good to not put myself in a position of danger. And remember when that was first revealed, the reaction that came from society. He was made fun of, he was lampooned. And yet, I don't know, it seems to me that if you want to exercise some level of discernment and discretion, that seems like a better way to go than the way in which the president may have gone in the past. Yeah,
certainly. I mean, the folks that came out of the woodwork to mock Mike Pence are the folks that typically come out of the woodwork to mock traditional beliefs in this country. And Jeremy said earlier, he's looking smarter all the time.
Let me just, before we run out of time in this segment, get your comments at least, because we've had Judge John Bates, Federal District Court in the District of Columbia, argue that even though the so-called DACA, and you DACA and you have DAPA, but I'll just get into DACA for a minute, Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, which was a standard created by the former president, Barack Obama, by an executive order, cannot be removed by an executive order by the current president, Donald Trump. That doesn't make sense to me, but you guys are lawyers. Help me out.
Well, I'm sorry, I can't be much help with you, Kerby, because it doesn't make sense to me either. These are executive issues that we're supposed to have the executive be able to make in the freedom of setting the policies of his administration. And an executive action is not supposed to carry the full weight of law, like our legislature has considered it and duly passed it through both the bicameral processes that are available there. If a president is not permitted to act like an executive, then the promise of Article 1 is lost entirely. So it doesn't make any sense to me whatsoever. But this is yet one more example of why that we need to select and nominate men and women of high character and an understanding of limited government to be sitting on these benches, so that they will have that same commitment that Antonin Scalia had of saying there are words in our Constitution that have actual meaning that need to be followed, rather than having this amorphous, malleable Constitution that is somehow left to the whim and fancy and blowing of the wind that some judges seem to have.
And Kelly Shackelford, who of course you both know very well, sent me this piece from Rich Lowry called Judges for the Hashtag Resistance, because he believes that some of this simply comes from judges that don't look at the actual meaning of the law and the intended purpose of the Constitution.
Certainly, and you both expressed this is hard to understand. Well, you both probably made the classic mistake of trying to apply common sense when you're dealing with the law. So,
or liberals.
Yeah, well, either way. It's clearly an outcome based judicial analysis. It's okay. Obama can do this, but Trump can't undo it.
Yeah.
by the same thing, because well, that would reach an outcome that I'm not happy with.
Yes.
And Scalia once said, a judge that likes every decision he arrives at is a bad judge.
Yes. Yeah, you're going to come up with some that you would not have expected to have. And my classic case of Justice Scalia was back in 1984 when I was at the Republican convention. I saw a guy burn the American flag, and that went all the way to the Supreme Court. Even though Justice Scalia did not like the idea of burning a flag, he rejected that outright. He still recognized, well, it's First Amendment, so he actually ruled in a way that he would disagree with, but he wanted to uphold the Constitution. Liberals never seem to do it that way, but some of these originalists really do. I'm going to come back and talk about whether senators are failing the religious test, and maybe we've got the wrong idea about the separation of church and state. All that coming up right after this.
Many tributes to former First Lady and First Mom Barbara Bush describe her 1990 Wellesley graduation speech, which placed her, at least according to the Washington Post, at the center of a national debate about the nature of feminism that would continue for decades. Feminists claim their movement is about making choices, but 150 Wellesley students protested that Mrs. Bush had, quote, gained recognition through the achievements of her husband. Not quite the Wellesley way. In the end, she wowed the crowd, telling them that, quote, you are a human being first, and those human connections with spouses, with children, with friends, are the most important investments you will ever make. In a recent National Review article, Heather Wilhelm contrasts what she calls today's sad feminism with the values exhibited in Barbara Bush's life. She writes that as Mrs. Bush rose above society's dream, so did Tammy Jo Schultz, the Southwest airline pilot who just last week guided a crippled plane to a safe landing after the mid-air explosion of one of its engines. Heather Wilhelm points out that Captain Schultz, age 56, learned to fly in the Navy at a time when the idea of women flying fighter jets often earned dismissive scoffs. Growing up near an Air Force base, she watched jets in action and fell in love. Ms. Wilhelm says modern feminism tells women there is one way to think, to the left, and the Barbara Bush-like dream of being a full-time mother and devoting time to family is often brushed aside as less worthy than the aspiration to be a scientist or an engineer or a CEO. A better feminism would applaud women who find ways to make life better for those whom God places in their orbit. This feminism would empower a woman, perhaps a pilot, perhaps a first lady, who carries out with calm and grace, and often with nerves of steel, the roles life tosses her way. For Point of View, I'm Penna Dexter.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes, and again, we have two individuals in studio here that are with First Liberty. And Lathan, first of all, let me commend you for a piece that we've posted here. It's called Why the Left is Wrong About Jefferson's Wall of Separation Between Church and State. It appears in the Daily Signal. This has been picked up all over the place. Jeremy, every time I turn around, this is getting picked up somewhere else, right?
Yeah, been Daily Signal, then went to Newsweek, and then he was such an expert that Forbes, right down on an entirely different topic, decided to quote from him on it as well. So I suspect before long, New York Times are going to be calling, and who knows who else.
Yeah, so, and it'll be
I won't hold my breath.
Yeah, hold appointment to the Supreme Court for all we know. But anyway, no. Educate us on this, because 2 weeks ago was the birthday Thomas Jefferson. He wrote after a while in the presidency, a letter, very famous letter to the Danbury Baptist Association, where he just talked about the wall of separation. It just faded into obscurity until 1947, when Justice Hugo Black actually revived it, and now it's quoted all the time. But we misunderstand what this idea of separation, church and state, is, right?
Correct. Yes. I mean, it's been taken from context. One sentence in one letter over the career of a very complex man and a very influential man,
right?
And made out to be as this is how you define Jefferson, and this is how we define Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment of a religion.
Sure.
You can look at the actions Jefferson took as president. You can read the volumes of other things that he wrote as president, and you can read the First Amendment, the text of the First Amendment. Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment of a religion. There cannot be an official state church of the United States of America. They had left a country that had the official Church of England. Mm-hmm. They didn't want an official state church here in the United States of America. That is designed to keep the government out of God's business, not the other way around.
Yes. And so, again, your piece really goes into almost 4 pages of great material. And, again, I would encourage people to read it because, number one, you give us a little bit of historical context to Thomas Jefferson. And anybody that's listened to Jeremy's First Liberty briefing, you've gone into some of this as well. But then you also talk about a couple of the cases that you have been dealing with. One has to do with the county commissioners, whether they can have a prayer before their commission's meeting. And again, can't even imagine why that would be controversial. You have a story about Tony Richardson, who just said, I'll pray for you. And again, if you take that the wrong way, even saying God bless you in the workplace would be wrong. And then, of course, Oscar Rodriguez, which we've talked about before, decorated Air Force veteran. As soon as he mentions God, he's pulled out of that ceremony. So if nothing else, Jeremy, this is just an attempt to bring some needed correction for a lot of people that are convinced the word separation of church and state's in the Constitution, but it's not.
Yeah, and especially for those who just use it sloppily, to make sure we understand what this is in context, but also what it means today. And how do you use it? I mean, how do you share this information with your friends? For instance, this weekend, we're going to have a video coming out on First Liberty's Facebook page. If you go to Facebook and then First Liberty Institute's Facebook page, follow us this weekend because there's going to be a video with Lathan. You'll get to actually see what he looks like and be able to hear and see kind of how he unpacks this in a really educational environment. And then you can share that with your friends as well so that they understand this kind of wrong-headed thinking about what the separation of church and state actually means and what it actually should mean, especially in the lives of our real life and blood clients today.
Yes. Well, again, that article's there. We will post your video as soon as it comes out here. But you can go to firstliberty.org, and we'll talk more about what's there in just a minute. But the other article that we've posted here is by you, Jeremy, and that is in The Hill, which is the organ of record for Capitol Hill. Senators are failing the religious test for office. And as we mentioned earlier, of course, you have Mike Pompeo, who was confirmed, but Senator Cory Booker was convinced that just because he holds to traditional Christian values, that's enough to say he should be disqualified from office. That's not allowed by the Constitution, is it?
No, it is not. In fact, we have a clause in Article 6 that reads, no religious test shall ever be required as a qualification to any office or public trust under the United States. And yet we've seen a growing trend of United States senators. The latest is Cory Booker from New Jersey to have really angrily taken to task Mike Pompeo, the now Secretary of State, during his confirmation hearings for his religious beliefs when it comes to human sexuality. You had Bernie Sanders take to task Russell Vought, the Deputy Director of the Office of Management and Budget, for his religious convictions from his time at Wheaton. You've seen Dick Durbin from Illinois and Senator Feinstein from California, who imposed the religious test upon Judge Amy Coney Barrett. And remember, Senator Feinstein famously said that her dogma lives loudly within her.
Yes.
This kind of stuff is not permitted. And so the point of my piece and my encouragement to any future nominees that are out there that may face this firing squad or these bullying and demagoguery tactics that now passes for advice and consent is to simply return that with a smile, to say, Senator, your question poses a religious test for office, and under Article 6, I hereby decline to answer. I am protected against responding to that religious test for office. I'd like to see what the response will be. Now, I suspect it'll be apoplexia. They will be more upset by the reality that you invoked a limitation upon their office. But those who are always willing or wanting to push out the bonds of limitation usually are apoplectic at such things, and that's a good thing. So we go to great length to claim the fifth so we don't incriminate ourselves in a court of law or elsewhere. Go ahead and claim the sixth here, the Article 6 of the Constitution that says you cannot impose this religious test upon my office. We can talk more about how important that is for our society and our democracy, but the point is that the senators need to stop doing that very thing.
Well, again, two very good articles that are available to you. But let's just, before we run out of time, Jeremy, I'll just come back to you and talk about what's available at First Liberty. First of all, I would encourage you to sign up to get your prayer updates, because any day now we're going to be finding out if any or if all of your 6 cases that might be in the Supreme Court are going to be accepted, and certainly to be in prayer for some of these individuals. Coach Kennedy, if nothing else, deserves our prayer every single day, don't you think?
Absolutely.
Some of these people are just going through so much right now. Marianne Sauce, telling her she can't pray in her own home. So when they go to the website, talk about what's available to them right there.
Well, there are a lot of things there. Number one, you can find out a lot of great information. Know what your rights actually are so that you can employ them on a day-to-day basis, and you can tell your friends about what their rights are as well. Be a culture, an agent for change in your own community about these issues of religious liberty. But you can also, very importantly, if you have had your religious liberty question, there's a great little tab up in the right-hand corner that says Get Legal Help Now. We'd like to hear from you. Look, we win a lot of these cases. And when our clients come to us with real problems, we sit down with them most of the time in their kitchens or in their places of their house or wherever they're at. We can sit with them, look them in the eye, evaluate their case face-to-face, and then make a plan to go forward. And then we usually win. That's huge. I mean, today, Tony Richardson has a job because we sat down with her, we created a plan, and we pushed back against an administration of a school that says you can't say God bless you to a colleague of yours or tell them that you're praying for them, even if you go to that person, go to church with that person. So she has a job today because we were able to stand beside her and protect her religious liberty in the public schools. So there's all kinds of more information on there. You can follow us on Facebook and Twitter. Facebook and Twitter are kind of controlling what you can and cannot see these days, it seems like. So it's probably a good idea for you to sign up for our email newsletter as well so we can communicate directly with you. We want to make sure you see these articles that we're writing, that our attorneys are putting out there. We've had one per week in some publication in this country so far this year. So there's lots of good stuff for you to be following and writing and then sharing with your friends.
Yeah. Lathan, thank you for joining us. It's the first
so
time
much.
we've had you in here, and let's do that again. And, of course, Jeremy, we hear you every single day during our break that just took place with the First Liberty briefing. So, again, lots of great resources, many articles we've posted, and I hope you'll have a great weekend. Take the time to read these, maybe hit that share button, put them on your Facebook page, educate some people. Have a great weekend. See you back here on Monday, right here on Point of View.
Is religious freedom still a cornerstone of the Republic, or has it effectively been crushed by the forces of tolerance? America needs Christians to be informed and as unified as possible, applying God's wisdom to civic life. Point of View can be a key part of a successful mission. I believe in America. I believe God wants His best for us. We can face whatever the world throws at us as long as we stand together. If you have not signed on, please do it now. Support Point of View Radio today at pointofview.net. Set up your monthly gift by clicking the Truth Team 360 picture and then carefully follow the directions. Pointofview.net. By phone, you can give at 1-800-347-5151. 800-347-5151. Or mail that first donation to Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221. Box 30, Dallas 75221. Or call us 800-347-5151. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.